Section 1. The show that couldn't stop making enemies. There is something almost comforting about a show that has been in trouble for as long as anyone can remember. A show that woke up every single morning of its existence, walked straight into the living room of American television, and immediately started an argument with someone. Family Guy has been doing exactly that since the 31st of January 1999, when it first aired on Fox right after Super Bowl 33, in front of approximately 22 million people who had no idea what they were about to watch. And in the more than 2 decades since that night, the show has accumulated a record of scandals, bans, lawsuits, feuds, and moments of genuine cultural chaos that would be hard to believe if it were all made up. But it is not made up. Every bit of it happened. What makes Family Guy particularly interesting to look at through the lens of controversy is that the show never really tried to avoid it. Most television programs, when they stumble into a scandal, spend weeks doing damage control. Publicists draft apologies. Executives hold emergency meetings. Showrunners go on record saying the intention was never to offend anyone. Family Guy mostly did the opposite. When someone got angry at the show got louder. When a country banned it, the writers made jokes about it. When a watchdog organization filed thousands of complaints with federal regulators, the creator called them names in the press. There is a kind of consistency to that approach, even if the consistency is mostly just stubbornness wearing a Halloween costume. And yet, for all the chaos that follows this show around like a shadow, there is also something genuinely worth examining in all of it. Because Family Guy's controversies are not just a collection of offensive moments strung together. They are a map of what American television was willing to say, what it was not willing to say, who got to decide the difference, and how those decisions changed across more than 25 years. Every ban, every lawsuit, every angry press release from a watchdog group, every celebrity who picked up the phone to call their lawyer after watching the Sunday night lineup, all of it tells you something about the culture that produced the show and the culture the show was pushing back against. To understand the depth of this, you have to start where most stories about Family Guy start, which is with Seth MacFarlane himself. He was born in Kent, Connecticut in 1973, and by the time he was pitching a cartoon to Fox in 1998, he had already been working in animation for several years. He studied at the Rhode Island School of Design, then got a job working on shows at Hanna-Barbera, contributing to Dexter's Laboratory and Johnny Bravo. He was young, he had strong opinions, and he had a very specific idea of what kind of show he wanted to make. The pitch that eventually became Family Guy was built around 2 short films he had made called The Life of Larry and Steve, featuring a man named Larry and his talking dog named Steve. Those 2 characters evolved, the family around them was constructed, and the whole thing landed on Fox's desk with enough energy and personality that the network gave it a green light. What is important to understand about the show's origins is that it was never supposed to be safe. It was designed from the very first episode to comment on the same culture it was entertaining, to poke at things that polite television did not poke at, and to do all of it with a specific brand of humor that bounced between sharp cultural observation and completely unhinged absurdity. That combination was the whole engine of the show, and from the very first season, people were already lining up to complain about it. The Parents Television Council, a conservative media watchdog organization that would become Family Guy's most persistent public enemy, was paying attention from the beginning. The PTC had been founded in 1995 by L. Brent Bozell III with the goal of monitoring television for content that the group considered inappropriate for family viewing. By the time Family Guy's 2nd season was airing, the PTC had already begun writing about the show as an example of everything wrong with network television. That early relationship between the show and its critics set the tone for the decades of conflict that followed. But here is the thing about the early controversies. Looking back at them now, they feel almost quaint compared to what came later. The show that drew complaints in 1999 and 2000 was, by the standards of what Family Guy would eventually become, relatively restrained in its provocations. The characters still had heart, the humor was sharp, the offensive moments usually had some larger comedic purpose behind them. The critics were already screaming, but the show was actually still doing the careful balance between transgression and craft that makes transgression worthwhile. The real controversies, the ones that left lasting marks on the show's history and on the people involved with it, came later. They came as the show survived 2 cancellations, clawed its way back from the dead twice, and settled into a long run that nobody in 1999 could have predicted. They came as the creative decisions got bolder and sometimes sloppier, as the targets of the humor got more personal, and as the cultural moment around the show shifted in ways that made some of its choices feel different than they had when they were first written. Over the next few hours, we are going to go through all of it. The banned episodes and why they got banned, the lawsuits and what actually happened when they reached a courtroom, the celebrities who fought back and the ones who did not. The moment Brian Griffin died and the internet nearly caught fire, Seth MacFarlane's own personal controversies, including one Oscars moment that looked like a cheap joke until years later when everyone understood what it actually was. The war with South Park that has never been fully resolved. The country that banned the show because of a song about marijuana. The federal agency that received nearly 200,000 complaints about a single episode. And the very strange, very public falling out between the show's creator and the network that gave him his career. All of it told slowly, the way a long story deserves to be told. So settle in, get comfortable, and let's start at the beginning of the trouble. Hey, if you are watching this right now, drop a comment down below and let us know where you are in the world and what time it is. We love knowing who is watching and from where. And if you have not already, hit that subscribe button. It really does help keep this kind of content coming. Section 2. The episodes Fox never wanted you to see. Every long-running television show has the episodes that never quite made it out into the world the way the people who made them intended. Scripts that got rewritten at the last minute because a network executive got nervous. Scenes that were quietly trimmed between the original broadcast and the rerun. Moments that showed up in some countries and vanished in others. Family Guy has all of those things, but it also has something rarer, which is episodes that were completed, animated, voice-acted, scored, and delivered to the network, and then either banned outright or pulled from circulation because of what happened in the real world after they aired. The most famous of these, the one that gets brought up every single time this topic comes up, is called Partial Terms of Endearment. It was the final episode of Season 8, written by Danny Smith, and it centered on Lois agreeing to become a surrogate mother for a college friend and her husband. The episode takes the premise in a direction that was always going to be difficult. The couple who hired Lois as their surrogate dies in a car accident before the baby is born, which leaves Lois in the position of having to decide what to do with a pregnancy that nobody is waiting for anymore. The episode engages seriously, for Family Guy, with the question of abortion, presenting multiple perspectives without completely resolving the tension between them. It ends with Peter turning to the camera and delivering a single line that brings everything to an abrupt close. The creative team was actually proud of the episode. Seth MacFarlane has talked about it in interviews, describing how writer Danny Smith did careful research for the script, including drawing from an essay by Carl Sagan about the ethics of abortion from his book Billions and Billions. MacFarlane has said that Fox knew the episode was being made, and that the network's position going in was essentially that they could make it, but that Fox reserved the right not to air it. That is the agreement that was in place when the episode was completed, and Fox followed through on the reservation. They decided not to air it in the United States. The BBC aired it in the United Kingdom on the 20th of June, 2010, during a primetime slot, and it reportedly reached over 1 million homes. Reviews were generally positive. Critics in Britain found it clever and surprisingly thoughtful for a show more associated with randomness than substance, but in America, it never broadcast. It appeared on the Season 8 DVD box set, which is how many American fans have seen it, but it has never been on American television. As of when this was written, it is also not available on Hulu, which carries essentially all other Family Guy episodes. Partial Terms of Endearment is still, to this day, the only Family Guy episode that was completed, delivered, and then never aired on American television. It exists in a category by itself. The announcement of the ban came in an unusual way. The Family Guy team broke the news themselves at San Diego Comic-Con in 2009, before Season 8 had even aired. MacFarlane and the writers told the audience at the panel that Fox had decided not to air the episode, and the room reacted with a mix of outrage and curiosity. That public unveiling of a ban before the show even started its new season was itself a kind of theatrical act, and it had the effect of turning the episode into one of the most sought-after pieces of Family Guy content in the show's history. People who might never have gone looking for it specifically went looking for it because they had been told they could not watch it. The second episode with a complicated broadcast history is When You Wish Upon a Weinstein, which was the 22nd episode of Season 3. The episode aired eventually, but not when it was supposed to. Fox was concerned that its premise, which centered on Peter seeking out a Jewish financial advisor based on a stereotype about Jewish people and money, might be read as anti-Semitic. The song at the heart of the episode, called I Need a Jew, was a parody of When You Wish Upon a Star from the Disney film Pinocchio. Peter sings it out a window while looking for financial help. And the whole thing is built on the kind of absurdist stereotyping that the show often uses to make a larger point about how stereotypes function. Fox originally scheduled the episode to air in 2000, but held it back. It sat on a shelf for 3 years before Cartoon Network's Adult Swim block aired it in 2003, during the same period when the reruns on that network were reviving interest in the show more broadly. Fox eventually aired it in 2004, years after it was originally intended to reach audiences. By that point, the episode had already been seen by a significant number of people through the Adult Swim broadcast. The delay created a downstream legal problem that nobody involved had quite anticipated. In October 2007, a music publisher called The Bourne Company sued Fox and the show's creators over the song, claiming that I Need a Jew was not a legitimate parody of When You Wish Upon a Star, but rather a copyright infringement. The suit also argued that the anti-Semitic lyrics damaged the value and reputation of the original song. The case wound its way through the courts for a couple of years before a federal judge ruled in favor of the show in March 2009. The judge, U.S. District Judge Deborah Batts, found that the song was clearly a parody and therefore protected under fair use doctrine. She also noted that the original song's long association with wholesome material like Pinocchio actually opened it up to exactly this kind of satirical treatment. The case cost money and time, but it ended the way the show's legal battles usually end, which is with Fox winning. The third major episode in this particular category is the one that probably got the most coverage at the time, because it involved a real-world tragedy occurring after the episode had already aired. Turban Cowboy was the 16th episode of Season 11, and it first aired on the 17th of March 2013. The episode's main story involves Peter befriending a Muslim man named Mahmoud, who is eventually revealed to be a radical terrorist. The episode has a cutaway gag in which Peter competes in the Boston Marathon by driving his car through the race and running over the participants. That gag exists in isolation, disconnected from the main plot in the way that cutaway gags on this show always are. The Boston Marathon bombing happened on the 15th of April, 2013, about a month after the episode first aired. 3 people died, and hundreds were injured, including 17 who lost limbs. In the immediate aftermath, someone on the internet took 2 unrelated scenes from Turban Cowboy and edited them together to create a video that appeared to show the episode predicting or even inspiring the bombing. The edited clip placed the marathon scene immediately next to a scene from a different part of the episode where a character detonates explosives remotely, making it look like a coherent narrative when in the actual episode, the scenes had nothing to do with each other. The edited clip spread rapidly. Alex Jones, the conspiracy theory media figure, promoted the clip on his InfoWars platform and on Twitter, using it to suggest that the episode was somehow connected to the attack. McFarlane responded quickly and forcefully. He called the edited clip abhorrent and stated clearly that it was a manipulation and that the episode had been created months before the tragedy. Fox pulled the episode from its website and from Hulu the following day. The network stated that it had no immediate plans to rebroadcast it. YouTube removed several of the edited clips but had difficulty keeping up with how quickly they were being re-uploaded. The episode remained off American streaming platforms for nearly a decade. It did not return to Hulu until September 2022, 9 years after the bombing. It is available in other countries, including on streaming services in the UK and Canada, where it was never pulled, but its American absence lasted for almost a full decade. When it came back to Hulu, there was almost no fanfare. It just quietly reappeared in the library alongside everything else, with no announcement. Its return was noticed mostly by fans who had been tracking its absence. Beyond these 3 main cases, the show has a long history of individual scenes and moments that got clipped, edited, or quietly altered between their first broadcast and later airings. The show's 4th season episode called Deep Throats features a scene that was censored in the original Fox broadcast but exists in a longer, more explicit form on DVD. An episode from the early seasons had a sequence involving a JFK bobblehead that was considered in poor taste and removed from some broadcasts. Another episode contained a segment involving Meg's outfit that was altered in reruns. There is also a category of episodes that were not banned but were the subject of sustained pressure campaigns aimed at getting them pulled. The episode called Screams of Silence, the story of Brenda Q, which aired in Season 10, approached the subject of domestic violence in a way that drew significant criticism from advocacy groups and critics alike. The episode's tone toward its subject was widely described as uncomfortable, and the AJ Hammer of CNN's Showbiz Tonight said on air that he was just shocked by what he saw, describing it as a depressing half-hour of television. The show was not pulled, and the episode remains in circulation, but the reaction to it generated more serious critical discussion than almost any other Family Guy controversy before it, because it touched on a subject where the stakes of getting the tone wrong feel genuinely high. The episode called Quagmire's Dad, from Season 8, also generated significant backlash, in this case from LGBTQ advocacy organizations. The episode involves Quagmire's father coming out as a transgender woman, and while critics noted that the episode made some thoughtful points about acceptance, they also pointed to a scene where Brian vomits after learning he had sex with her as shockingly insensitive. The Gay and Lesbian Alliance Against Defamation, known as GLAAD, released a public statement saying that the organization shared serious concerns being raised from within the community and that its entertainment media team was addressing those concerns directly with Fox. Season 13 also produced a moment of controversy before an episode even aired. The crossover episode with The Simpsons, titled The Simpsons Guy, included a scene where Stewie makes a rape joke that appeared in the promotional trailer before the full episode broadcast. Tim Winter, who was the president of the Parents Television Council at the time, wrote directly to both Matt Groening, the creator of The Simpsons, and to Seth MacFarlane, as well as to Fox, arguing that jokes about sexual assault contribute to normalizing violence and that children who watch The Simpsons but not Family Guy would be unprepared for that kind of content. MacFarlane, in an interview with Entertainment Weekly, defended the joke. Fox declined to comment through a spokesperson. What ties all of these episodes together is not necessarily that any single one of them represents an unambiguous mistake. Some of them, like partial terms of endearment, represent genuinely careful work on a difficult subject that got caught in a political moment where the subject itself was too charged for broadcast. Others, like Turban Cowboy, were victims of timing in a way that nobody could have predicted. And some of them represent moments where the show's ambition to provoke outpaced its ability to handle the provocation responsibly. But all of them are part of the same larger story, which is the story of a show that was constantly testing the boundaries of what American broadcast television would permit, and occasionally finding out exactly where those boundaries were by running straight into them. The cumulative effect of all these incidents on the show's cultural standing is interesting to trace. Every time an episode got pulled or banned, it generated attention that drew more viewers to the episodes that were not banned. Every lawsuit that ended in Fox's favor reinforced the legal position that the show's style of parody was protected speech. Every watchdog group complaint that went unanswered by the FCC demonstrated that the regulators did not consider the show's content to cross the line into actionable indecency. The show was building a kind of legal and cultural armor around itself through the sheer volume of its controversies, and by the time it reached its later seasons, it had a track record so long and so well established that new controversies barely made news unless they were unusually dramatic. There is one more episode in this category worth mentioning, which is an episode from Season 21 that very nearly got the show banned in Russia. In an episode called From Russia with Love, the plot involves Meg traveling to the Russian city of Chelyabinsk, where the show depicted the city and its residents in a way that Russian officials found offensive. Venezuela had already banned the show in 2009. Russia had been paying attention to Family Guy for years. The combination of the episode's content and the broader political climate between the United States and Russia at the time created a moment where a nationwide ban seemed genuinely possible. It never happened. The show was not banned in Russia as a result of that episode, though the situation highlighted that the show's reach into international television markets meant its controversies now had diplomatic implications that the first 3 seasons never had to consider. Section 3. The Real People Who Fought Back. There is a long tradition in American comedy of using real, named public figures as material. Satire has always been a form of speech that relies on its targets being recognizable. The joke only works if the audience knows who is being mocked. Family Guy understands this deeply and has used it throughout its run, depicting celebrities, politicians, religious figures, and cultural icons in ways that range from gentle ribbing to something considerably sharper. Most of the time, the targets of these jokes say nothing publicly. Some of them appreciate it. Being parodied by a major network television show is, in certain corners of the entertainment industry, a sign that you have arrived. But every so often, someone being depicted on Family Guy decides that they have had enough, and they reach for their phone and call a lawyer. The most high-profile legal battle in the show's history involving a real person was the one brought by comedian Carol Burnett. The episode at the center of the dispute was called Pederotica, from Season 4, which aired on the 23rd of April 2006. The episode involves Peter visiting an adult bookstore. In a brief moment, about 5 seconds long, Quagmire points out that Carol Burnett works there part-time as a janitor, and the camera reveals a character who is clearly modeled on Burnett's famous charwoman character, a cleaning woman she had made famous through years of recurring appearances on The Carol Burnett Show between 1967 and 1978. The charwoman was a signature creation for Burnett, a beloved character associated with her legacy in sketch comedy. What made the Burnett case particularly notable was that Family Guy's creators had not obtained permission to use the charwoman character. The charwoman belonged to Burnett. She had created it. Family Guy had borrowed it without asking. In March 2007, roughly a year after the episode aired, Burnett filed a lawsuit against 20th Century Fox for over $2 million, citing copyright infringement and the misappropriation of her name and likeness. She also alleged that the show had used an altered version of the Carol Burnett Show's theme music. Fox's legal defense rested primarily on the argument that the segment was a parody and therefore protected under the fair use doctrine in American copyright law. The studio also pointed to Burnett's own long career in satire and the mockery of celebrities, arguing that someone with her background in that tradition was in a somewhat awkward position objecting to a brief comedic reference. The legal proceedings lasted several months, and in June 2007, a federal judge ruled in favor of Fox. The judge agreed that the depiction of the charwoman was a parody and therefore protected by the First Amendment guarantee of free speech. The ruling acknowledged that the portrayal was distasteful in context, given the setting of the episode, but found that the show had the right to use the character in that way. Burnett lost the case, and the episode remained unaltered. The ruling established important precedent for Family Guy's ongoing use of public figures and copyrighted material in its humor. It was not the last time the show would need to rely on the fair use argument, but having a clear legal victory in the Burnett case gave the show's lawyers a useful foundation to point to when later disputes arose. The second major lawsuit involving the show and a piece of music was the one brought by the Bourne Company over the I Need a Jew song from When You Wish Upon a Weinstein, which has already been covered in the previous section. But there were other smaller legal and public disputes worth examining, because together they revealed just how many people and organizations felt compelled to formally object to something the show had done. The Parents Television Council, as a conservative media watchdog organization, never went to court against Family Guy, but it spent years trying to use legal and regulatory mechanisms to pressure the show into changing its content. The PTC's preferred tool was the FCC complaint, and over the course of the show's run, the organization mobilized its membership to file enormous numbers of them. The largest single spike came after the airing of an episode called Family Gay on the 8th of March 2009. The episode's content included a cutaway sequence that the PTC described in its press release as including, among other things, a depiction of Stewie Griffin eating a bowl of cereal with horse semen instead of milk. The PTC filed a formal indecency complaint with the FCC and urged its 1.3 million members to do the same. The resulting flood of complaints totaled approximately 188,000, which was more than the FCC typically received in an entire month from all sources combined. The FCC declined to take action. The agency's position was essentially that the content, however unpleasant to many viewers, did not rise to the legal standard for actionable broadcast indecency. McFarlane's response to the PTC's campaign was characteristically unsparing. In an interview, he described receiving their complaints as like getting hate mail from Hitler, called the organization's leadership terrible human beings, and said they could all engage in an act that is not printable here. It was a relationship defined entirely by mutual contempt, and both parties seemed to find that arrangement perfectly comfortable. One of the more unusual real-person controversies that the show generated did not involve a lawsuit but did become a significant news story. In 2010, Family Guy aired an episode in which a character with Down syndrome is depicted making a reference to her mother being a former governor of Alaska. This was understood by virtually everyone who watched it as a reference to Sarah Palin, whose son Trig was born with Down syndrome. Palin publicly denounced the episode on Facebook, calling it a kick in the gut and arguing that the show was promoting cruelty toward people with disabilities. The voice actress who played the character, Andrea Faye Friedman, responded publicly and said that her condition was not something to be used as a political weapon, and that she, as a person with Down syndrome, was perfectly capable of speaking for herself. The resulting media coverage turned what might have been a brief controversy into a multi-day story about disability representation, political satire, and whether Palin's objection was a legitimate point about sensitivity or an attempt to use her son's medical condition for political advantage. Another notable incident involved Terry Schiavo, the Florida woman whose prolonged battle over life support had become one of the most emotionally raw political stories of the mid-2000s. Family Guy included a musical number in an episode called Peter Asment from Season 8 that mocked Schiavo directly with lyrics that described her as the most expensive plant you will ever see. The American Life League protested. Schiavo's brother Bobby Schindler Jr. publicly called on Fox to cancel Family Guy entirely. The protests drew attention but did not result in the episode being pulled or altered. The show has also generated real-person controversies involving Michael J. Fox and Parkinson's disease. An episode that made jokes about Fox's condition drew criticism from both disability advocates and from people who felt the jokes crossed from satire into something crueler. McFarlane and the writers defended the episode on the grounds that the show makes jokes about every condition and every group, and that singling out any particular group for special protection was itself a form of condescension. That argument reflects a genuine philosophy about comedy, but it has also been one of the most persistently debated questions surrounding the show, because the question of whether equal opportunity offense is actually equal in its impact has no clean answer. Beyond specific named individuals, the show has engaged in what might be called category controversies, moments where its treatment of a group rather than an individual person generated organized pushback. The LGBTQ community's response to the Quagmire's Dad episode is one example. Religious organizations have filed complaints and written public letters about episodes they found blasphemous. The Catholic League specifically called out an episode from 2007 that depicted Catholicism in a way the organization described as having assaulted and demeaned a faith. The Jewish community's relationship with the show has been more complex, with some critics pointing to episodes they found anti-Semitic, and others noting that the show has consistently included nuanced Jewish characters and storylines that complicate any simple reading of its content. What comes through across all of these disputes is that Family Guy exists in a permanent state of contested meaning. The people who made the show, the people who watched it, and the people who objected to it were frequently watching three completely different programs. The show's creator saw satire designed to expose the absurdity of prejudice by exaggerating it to a point of ridiculousness. Many fans saw a program that was simply funnier than the alternatives because it was willing to go where others would not. And the people who filed complaints, brought lawsuits, or wrote angry letters to Fox saw a program that was causing real harm to real communities by normalizing mockery of things that deserve respect. None of those three readings is entirely wrong, and none of them is entirely right. The truth is somewhere in the overlap between them, in the specific moments where the show's execution was sharp enough to justify the provocation, and the equally specific moments where the execution failed and left nothing behind except the offense. The most interesting real-person story connected to Family Guy is actually not a lawsuit or a public protest. It is the story of a joke that was made in 2013 that almost nobody understood at the time, but that 4 years later would turn out to have a meaning that changed how people thought about the person who made it. That story belongs in its own section, because it involves Seth MacFarlane himself, one of the most famous stages in the entertainment industry, and a producer who at the time was one of the most powerful people in Hollywood. Section 4. The Death That Broke the Internet. On the 24th of November, 2013, a Sunday night in late November, Family Guy aired an episode called Life of Brian. It was the 6th episode of the 12th season. The episode began with Brian and Stewie going back in time to 17th century Jamestown, running into trouble with the local population, and eventually having to find their way back to the present. On the way home, Stewie destroys his time machine because he has decided that the risk of altering the course of history every time they use it is too great. He smashes it at the junkyard. And then, while he and Brian are retrieving a street hockey net they find at that same junkyard, a car comes around a corner and hits Brian. The sequence that follows is surprisingly quiet for a show that almost never stops moving. Brian is rushed to an animal hospital. The veterinarian tells the family that his injuries are fatal. The Griffins gather around Brian to say goodbye. Before he loses consciousness, he tells the family that he loves them. Stewie, in a scene that was visibly more emotionally raw than most of what this show produces, blames himself for destroying the time machine. And then Brian dies. Within hours, the internet erupted. The hashtag #BringBackBrian was trending on Twitter by the following morning. A petition appeared on change.org that read, in part, that Brian Griffin was an important part of the viewing experience, that he added a witty and sophisticated element to the show, and that Family Guy and Fox Broadcasting would lose viewers if Brian was not brought back. That petition gained thousands of signatures in its first hours online and eventually exceeded 100,000 signatures. It became, at that moment, one of the fastest-growing entertainment-related petitions the site had ever seen. The reaction went beyond digital petitions. Some fans got tattoos, actual memorial tattoos with the words "Rip Brian" and images of the character. Facebook memorial pages appeared, one of them accumulating more than 758,000 likes within a few days. A website appeared under the domain briansannouncement.com that displayed a countdown clock, leading fans to speculate that the domain had been registered by Fox and that Brian would be brought back at the end of the countdown. Fox quickly denied any connection to the site, calling it a hoax. The countdown expired with no announcement from anyone affiliated with the show. The story made national headlines. Major news outlets covered it as a genuine cultural event. The death of a cartoon dog who had been voiced by the same man who created the show, who was beloved for his dry wit and his barely concealed emotional vulnerability, had generated a level of public grief that would have been more appropriate for an actual person than for an animated character. And that response, the scale of it and the sincerity of it, said something meaningful about the relationship between this particular audience and this particular character. Seth MacFarlane, speaking to reporters a few weeks after the episode aired, said he was very surprised by the size of the reaction. He framed the positive interpretation of it as evidence that people still cared enough about the character to be that angry, which he found genuinely moving. He noted that the plan had always been to create what he called a little bit of a stir, but that the rage the decision generated was not something he or his team had counted on. That admission raises a question that fans were asking loudly at the time, which is whether the whole thing was ever meant to be permanent. The evidence strongly suggests that it was not. Just 2 episodes after Life of Brian, on the 15th of December 2013, the episode called Christmas Guy aired. In it, Stewie, who has been devastated by Brian's death, encounters a version of himself from a slightly different timeline, a Stewie who still has his time machine. Past Stewie gives his present self the time machine, and present Stewie uses it to go back to the moment just before Brian was hit by the car and push him out of the way, preventing the accident. Brian returned to life. Everything reset. Vinny, the replacement Italian-accented dog who had been voiced by Tony Sirico of The Sopranos, departed almost as quickly as he had arrived. MacFarlane tweeted after Christmas Guy aired, in a message that was simultaneously warm and a little mocking, saying thanks for caring so much about the canine Griffin, and then adding, in a follow-up tweet, that he asked whether anyone really thought they would kill off Brian permanently. The wording of that follow-up, with its mild mockery of the audience for taking the death seriously, added a layer of bitterness to the resolution for fans who had spent 3 weeks genuinely grieving. The critical assessment of the whole sequence was almost uniformly negative. Screen Rant ranked Life of Brian among the 12 worst episodes in the show's history, pointing to the abruptness of Brian's death and the rushed introduction of Vinny as replacement character. Other critics noted that the swift resurrection had confirmed the worst reading of the original episode, which was that it was never anything more than a rating stunt designed to get people talking. Executive producer Steve Callahan had said, in the immediate aftermath of the initial episode, that the idea to kill off a main character had caught fire in the writer's room and that it seemed like a fun way to shake things up. That framing, fun to shake things up, did not exactly age well in light of what followed. There is a real tension at the heart of the Brian death controversy that goes beyond whether the decision was a stunt. The deeper question is what it means for a show to put its audience through genuine emotional distress, to engineer a grief response in people who had spent years caring about a character, and then to undo it almost immediately and publicly mock the emotional response it had deliberately provoked. Family Guy had always played with the idea that nothing on the show had permanent consequences, that the status quo would reset at the end of every episode. But the Brian death pushed that implicit contract to a place that felt qualitatively different from a typical episode ending. It asked people to feel something real, and then it laughed at them for feeling it. MacFarlane's own comments after the resurrection suggested that, from his perspective, the measure of success was the rating spike the controversy generated, not the quality of the emotional experience it created for the audience. He said explicitly that it did what it was designed to do. That framing, what it was designed to do, treats the audience's feelings as a mechanism for driving viewership numbers, rather than as a response to be respected. For long-term fans of the show who had watched Brian's character develop over 12 seasons, that felt like a betrayal of a different kind than anything the show had done before. The fact that Vinny, the replacement dog, was voiced by Tony Sirico, who was one of the most beloved character actors in American television from his years on The Sopranos, added a strange note to the whole story. Sirico brought genuine warmth and humor to the role in the brief time the character existed. There was a version of events in which Family Guy, emboldened by the shock of Brian's death, might have committed to the change and allowed Vinny to become a genuinely new and different presence on the show. That did not happen. Vinny disappeared as quickly as he arrived, and in the process, the show demonstrated that it was not actually willing to live with the consequences of the boldest creative decision it had made in years. The Brian death controversy is a kind of microcosm of a larger tension that has defined Family Guy's relationship with its audience across its entire run. The show built its reputation on being willing to go places that other television programs would not. It marketed itself on unpredictability. But when it actually committed to something genuinely unpredictable, when it followed through on a consequence in a way that felt real rather than performative, it panicked and reversed course within 3 episodes. The irony is that the resurrection of Brian is actually the thing that looks most like cowardice in this whole sequence of events. The killing was bold. The unkilling was the choice that revealed the show's limits. Section 5. Seth MacFarlane's personal controversies. There is a version of Seth MacFarlane's career that exists almost entirely separately from Family Guy, even though Family Guy is what made it possible. He directed a 2012 film called Ted that earned over $500 million worldwide. He hosted the Academy Awards in 2013. He created, starred in, and executive produced a science fiction series called The Orville that premiered in 2017 on Fox before moving to Hulu. He recorded multiple albums of big band and jazz standards. He produced a live-action Ted prequel series for Peacock. He signed a deal with NBC Universal in 2020 that was reportedly worth approximately $200 million. By any measure, he built one of the most successful independent entertainment empires in modern Hollywood, and across all of that, he accumulated his own set of controversies. Some of them were directly connected to Family Guy, but others were about his public persona, his comments, his choices as a public figure, and one very particular moment on a very particular stage. The Oscars hosting job in 2013 began generating controversy before the ceremony even happened. MacFarlane was announced as the host in September 2012, and the reaction from within the industry was mixed from the start. He was seen as a provocateur, as someone whose humor was calibrated for late-night television and adult animation, not for the ceremony that is supposed to celebrate the highest achievements in American film. Concerns about whether he would treat the occasion with appropriate gravitas were raised publicly by several critics. Some Academy members expressed reservations privately. What actually happened at the ceremony lived up to the concerns of those who had been worried and exceeded them. MacFarlane opened the show with a number called "We Saw Your Boobs," performed with the cast of The Sound of Music, in which he named specific actresses and listed films in which they had appeared nude. The moment generated an immediate reaction of widespread discomfort. Critics described it as crude, embarrassing, and exactly the kind of thing they had feared. Several of the actresses named were sitting in the audience, and their reactions, ranging from visible discomfort to nervous laughter, were caught on camera and circulated widely afterward. MacFarlane also made a joke about the film industry's relationship with Mel Gibson by describing him as a man who had been responsible for some of the best, most timeless, most beloved films in Hollywood history, followed by a beat, and then that is not actually the joke. The real joke was at Gibson's expense over his well-documented history of anti-Semitic remarks. That joke landed relatively well, but the "We Saw Your Boobs" number became the story of the night. Looking at coverage of the ceremony from 2013, what is striking is how little of it focused on the Harvey Weinstein joke that MacFarlane made during the nomination announcement segment earlier in the evening, before the ceremony itself. Standing with actress Emma Stone to unveil the Best Supporting Actress nominations, MacFarlane said, "Congratulations, you 5 ladies no longer have to pretend to be attracted to Harvey Weinstein." The audience laughed. The comment was noted in some coverage as a weird little jab, but was not treated as significant. Weinstein was at the height of his power in Hollywood at the time. The joke seemed like the kind of vague, inside baseball showbiz comment that famous people make about powerful people at industry events. 4 years later, in October 2017, the New York Times and the New Yorker published the investigations that exposed Weinstein's decades of sexual harassment and assault of women in the entertainment industry. In the immediate aftermath of those stories, the clip of MacFarlane's 2013 Oscar joke began circulating again because suddenly it looked like something completely different. It looked like a man who knew something. MacFarlane confirmed on Twitter that the joke had not been random. He wrote that in 2011, his friend and colleague Jessica Barth, who had worked with him on the TED films, confided in him about her encounter with Harvey Weinstein and his attempted advances. Barth had gone to Weinstein's hotel room under the impression that she was attending a business meeting, and Weinstein had demanded a naked massage. She left and was deeply shaken by the experience. MacFarlane said that when he hosted the Oscars in 2013, he could not resist the opportunity to take a hard swing in Weinstein's direction, and that the joke came from a place of loathing and anger. Barth herself defended MacFarlane publicly after his explanation circulated. She said that she wanted to point out to everyone attacking him that he was one of the few men in Hollywood speaking out, and encouraged people to applaud him rather than criticize him. The reaction to MacFarlane's explanation was complicated. Some people praised him for having used his platform to make even an oblique reference to Weinstein's behavior at a moment when speaking directly about it was difficult. Others argued that a veiled joke to a room of insiders was not the same as taking meaningful action, and that if he had genuinely known about specific harassment, the right response was not a punchline but a report. The debate touched on the broader question of what people in positions of power in Hollywood were doing during the years when Weinstein's behavior was an open secret in certain circles, and whether humor was a form of courage or a form of deflection. MacFarlane's public persona has been shaped over the years by his willingness to engage in political commentary, which is relatively unusual for entertainment figures at his level of success. He has been consistently vocal about gun control, about climate science, about LGBTQ rights, and about what he sees as the damage done by certain media figures. That last category led to some of his most public controversies as an individual, particularly his extended dispute with Tucker Carlson and Fox News, which will be covered in a later section. But it is worth noting here that his political outspokenness was both a defining characteristic and a source of friction throughout his career. Because a vocal liberal whose primary television property airs on the network associated with conservative media is in a genuinely unusual position. The TED films, while commercially successful, also generated their own smaller controversies. The first TED in 2012 was criticized by some Irish-American groups for jokes about Irish people that they found offensive. This was a complaint that MacFarlane and his team took less seriously than some others, given that the show had been making similar jokes about virtually every ethnic group for over a decade at that point. but it reflected the broader pattern of his career, which is that his work consistently generates responses from people who feel specifically targeted by its humor, and that MacFarlane's standard response is to point to the totality of the show's targets as evidence that no single group is being singled out. The other significant personal controversy of MacFarlane's career involves his relationship with Fox and the specific tension between being the creator of a successful show on a network he found increasingly difficult to be associated with. That story is long and strange enough that it deserves its own section. Section 6. The Religious Wars. There is a long list of organizations that have, at various points in Family Guy's history, filed formal complaints about the show, written public letters demanding changes to its content, called on Fox to cancel it, urged advertisers to pull their commercials, or organized letter-writing campaigns to the FCC. Most of these organizations fall broadly into the category of religious or values-based advocacy groups that object to what they see as the show's sustained mockery of faith, morality, and tradition. And in a purely descriptive sense, they are not wrong about what the show does. Family Guy has spent more than 25 years making jokes about God, Jesus, the Pope, organized religion in general, and virtually every specific religious tradition in particular. The show makes these jokes frequently, enthusiastically, and without a great deal of interest in balancing them with sympathetic representations of faith. Seth MacFarlane has publicly identified himself as an atheist on multiple occasions. He has been open about the fact that his own lack of religious belief shapes his perspective on organized religion, and that perspective is clearly present in the content of Family Guy. The show does not treat religion as a subject that deserves either reverence or neutral handling. It treats it as material, sometimes clever material, sometimes lazy material, but always material. The Parents Television Council's criticism of the show on religious grounds stretches back to the very beginning of the show's run. An episode from the second season called Holy Crap, which focused on Peter's relationship with his deeply religious Catholic father, drew a written rebuke from L. Brent Bozell III, the PTC's founder. Bozell wrote that the episode promoted anti-Catholicism and that the show was using religion as a punching bag. That criticism was the first in a long series of PTC statements about Family Guy's religious content, and the PTC would repeat the argument many times over the following 2 decades in increasingly formal terms. By 2006, the PTC had enough material to compile a comprehensive report on the show's treatment of religion. The report, published as part of a larger study called Faith in a Box, Entertainment, Television, and Religion 2005 to 2006, concluded that mockery of God is a constant on Family Guy. The report cited specific episodes and moments, cataloged the frequency with which religious figures were depicted negatively, and argued that the cumulative effect of the show's treatment of faith was to undermine religious belief in the audience. The Catholic League, a separate organization from the PTC that focuses specifically on anti-Catholic bias in media, has issued statements about Family Guy on multiple occasions. In April 2007, the League issued a statement about an episode it said had assaulted and demeaned Catholicism, noting that it was not the first time the show had targeted Catholic practices. The League had previously objected to an episode from December 2005 that the organization said disparaged the sacrament of baptism and the use of holy water. An episode from April 2000 contained a comment about Holy Communion that the Catholic League found offensive. In 2017, an episode called The Unnatural depicted the Eucharist, which is the central sacrament of Catholic Christianity, as mere cookies and punch. The Catholic League's response described this as an assault on the sacrament. The PTC made similar comments. Fox and the show did not respond publicly to these complaints. The show's handling of Jewish faith and identity has been more ambiguous than its treatment of Christianity, and the responses to it have been correspondingly more divided. Some Jewish commentators and critics have objected to specific episodes that they feel trade in harmful stereotypes, pointing to things like the I Need a Jew song from the banned Weinstein episode as evidence of anti-Semitic tendencies in the writing. Australian Jewish studies columnist Dvir Abramovich has made formal academic arguments about several Family Guy episodes, reinforcing Jewish stereotypes in ways he considers harmful. A 2014 piece in the Israeli newspaper Haaretz argued that a scene in the episode 3 Acts of God constituted evidence of a deeper anti-Semitism in MacFarlane's work. On the other hand, several Jewish critics and Jewish audiences have pushed back against these readings, arguing that the show's Jewish characters are among its more nuanced recurring figures, and that the humor around Jewish identity in the show is more often about exposing the absurdity of how non-Jewish people perceive Jewish people than about actually promoting negative views. The show's frequent use of the character Mort Goldman, who is Jewish, and its often pointed commentary on prejudice through the lens of characters who hold prejudiced views, complicates any simple reading of the content as straightforwardly anti-Semitic. The episode Family Gay, which generated the 188,000 FCC complaints, was specifically targeted by the PTC for its handling of sexuality rather than religion, but it illustrates the broader point about how the show's content interacts with different communities' standards of acceptable representation. The episode includes cutaway content that many viewers found deeply offensive regardless of their religious orientation. The scale of the complaint response, nearly 200,000 individual letters to a federal agency, was something that the FCC had essentially never seen for a single episode of any television program. The fact that the FCC declined to take action despite that volume of complaints says something important about the legal status of the kind of content Family Guy produces and about the limits of what regulatory bodies are actually empowered to do about humor that offends without crossing into legally actionable territory. What makes the religious controversy around Family Guy particularly interesting is that it has never been a simple story of a secular show attacking religion from the outside. Peter Griffin is canonically Catholic. His father, Francis Griffin, who appeared in multiple episodes before the character was written out following the death of the voice actor, was portrayed as a devout and often overbearing Catholic who drove Peter to eventually rebel against his religious upbringing. The show has explored Peter's complicated relationship with faith in several episodes, and some of those episodes have been genuinely thoughtful about the emotional weight of religious identity, even as they were also making jokes at religion's expense. MacFarlane's own position on religion is more nuanced than simply being an atheist who enjoys mocking believers. He has said in interviews that he finds value in the community and tradition that religious practice offers, while maintaining that he does not personally believe in the supernatural claims that underpin organized religion. That nuanced personal position does not always translate clearly into the show's humor, where the needs of comedy often flatten complexity in the service of a quicker laugh. But it is worth noting that the creator of Family Guy is not simply a person who thinks religious belief is stupid and wants to say so. He is someone who has thought about the subject, has complex feelings about it, and has chosen a comedic form that is poorly suited to expressing that complexity. The PTC, the Catholic League, and the other organizations that have filed complaints about the show's religious content are not wrong that the show disproportionately depicts faith in negative terms. They are right about that observation. Where they tend to go wrong, in the view of the show's defenders, is in the conclusion they draw from the observation, which is that depicting something negatively in comedy is the same as causing harm to the thing being depicted. Comedy has always had a complicated relationship with religion, and that relationship predates television by several centuries. The Family Guy controversies over religious content are the latest chapter in a much longer story about who gets to make jokes about sacred things and under what conditions those jokes are acceptable. Section 7. The South Park Wars. In the spring of 2006, the creators of South Park went to war with Family Guy, not with words in the press or with a single joke at a show's expense, but with an entire two-part episode dedicated to dissecting and dismissing the creative values of Seth MacFarlane's show. Those two episodes, called Cartoon Wars Part 1 and Cartoon Wars Part 2, aired on Comedy Central in April 2006, and they constituted one of the most sustained and specific critiques of another television program that American animated comedy had ever produced. To understand why this mattered and why the effects of it are still felt in conversations about Family Guy, you have to understand who was making it and from what position. Trey Parker and Matt Stone, the creators of South Park, had been making their show since 1997, 2 years before Family Guy first aired. South Park's creative approach was almost the polar opposite of Family Guy's. Where Family Guy built its comedy around quick cutaway gags that were largely disconnected from the main story, South Park constructed each episode as a coherent narrative, usually organized around a clear satirical point about whatever cultural or political topic the writers wanted to address that week. Where Family Guy treated continuity as optional and character as secondary to the joke, South Park maintained consistent characterization across episodes and built its humor out of the specific dynamics between specific people. Parker and Stone had watched Family Guy become enormously popular, and they had watched the critical community often group the two shows together as examples of the same kind of boundary-pushing adult animation. That grouping irritated them. In interviews, they had described being told, "You guys have one of the best shows on television. You and Family Guy as one of the meanest things anyone could say to them." They felt that the comparison was not only inaccurate but obscured something important about the difference between the two shows' approaches to comedy. Cartoon Wars used a smart satirical premise as its vehicle for the critique. An upcoming episode of Family Guy was supposed to depict the Prophet Muhammad as a character, which caused panic in the town of South Park because of fears about retaliatory violence from extremists. This premise allowed the episode to address a real conversation that was happening at the time, following a 2005 controversy in which a Danish newspaper's publication of Muhammad caricatures had sparked protests and riots in multiple countries. But the Muhammad question was really just a setup for the episode's actual target. Eric Cartman, South Park's most reliable vehicle for satirical commentary because he is the show's designated monster, travels to Hollywood to try to get the Family Guy episode pulled. He frames this as a principled stand against offensive content, but the audience quickly understands that he actually just wants to cancel Family Guy because he finds it lazy and unfunny, and he is using the Muhammad controversy as cover for his real agenda. When Cartman gets inside the Family Guy studio, he discovers the show's writing staff. They are manatees, large, slow-moving aquatic mammals who live in a massive tank and generate the show's jokes by selecting balls from a pile, each of which has a word printed on it, and then dropping those balls into a machine that combines them into a cutaway gag. The machine produces a sample joke: laundry, date, winning, Mexico. Gary Coleman. The staffer announces that it is a perfect Family Guy joke. The implication is clear. Family Guy jokes are not crafted by human writers making intentional creative choices. They are the random output of a system that combines unrelated pop culture references and nouns until something lands. The comedy is mechanical. There is no thought behind it. You could replace any cutaway with any other cutaway and nothing would change, because none of them connect to anything. McFarlane, speaking to Rolling Stone in 2012, said he thought the South Park episode was funny and accurate. He acknowledged the critique and said he could see the merit in it, which was a more gracious response than many people expected from him. He said the thing he did not understand was the personal venom that Parker and Stone expressed in press appearances outside the context of the episode, where they attacked the show and McFarlane himself in ways that felt less like comedy and more like genuine hostility. He said he found that confusing, partly because he did not actually know them well enough to understand where it was coming from. Parker and Stone did not moderate their position. In various interviews and press appearances over the years, they made clear that the critique in Cartoon Wars was not just a one-time joke. "I just want to say, for the record right now, we've seen Family Guy. We do hate it," Parker said at one point. Stone has made similar comments. The feud is one-sided in the sense that Family Guy has never dedicated an equivalent amount of sustained creative energy to attacking South Park, but it has not been entirely silent on the subject either. Family Guy's response, when it came, was more indirect. In a 2009 episode called Spies Reminiscent of Us, Peter Griffin participates in an improv comedy show where only his style of non-sequitur humor gets laughs from the crowd, while more structured, narrative-based comedy gets silence. It is not the most devastating counterattack in the history of television rivalries, but it was an acknowledgement that the show was aware of the South Park critique and had decided to respond by defending its own approach rather than abandoning it. What made the South Park episode's critique land with particular force in the wider critical community was that it was backed up by something that felt true about Family Guy's writing, especially in the post-revival seasons. The show was leaning harder on cutaway gags than it had in its early seasons. The stories connecting those gags were getting thinner. The moments where a cutaway felt organic to its context were becoming rarer, while the moments where a cutaway felt genuinely interchangeable with any other cutaway were becoming more common. Parker and Stone were not making an unfair observation. They were making a precise one. The response from other animated shows was also revealing. After Cartoon Wars aired, Parker and Stone received calls from writers on both The Simpsons and King of the Hill, according to Stone's comments on a DVD commentary track. The Simpsons team apparently sent flowers. The King of the Hill team told Parker and Stone that they were doing God's work. Parker noted at the time that there was what he called an animation solidarity moment, where everyone in the industry came together over what he described as their shared feelings about Family Guy's approach to comedy. That response from other shows was interesting partly for what it revealed about the industry's private opinion of Family Guy. The show was enormously popular and commercially successful. It generated a devoted fan base and strong ratings for Fox during the peak of its popularity. But in the rooms where other animated shows were made, it was apparently viewed with a significant degree of skepticism and even contempt by people who felt that its success had been achieved through shortcuts and that the shortcuts were making the broader medium look worse. Parker and Stone also received backlash for Cartoon Wars from viewers who felt that the criticism was unfair or hypocritical. South Park has itself been accused of lazy shock humor, of making offensive jokes for their own sake, and of repeating certain jokes and storylines across its long run. The same arguments that Cartoon Wars makes about Family Guy can be applied with some adjustment to South Park itself. The difference is one of degree and intention rather than kind. But the critique landed effectively because it articulated something that many Family Guy fans had been feeling without being able to name it, which was that the show's signature joke format was starting to feel less like a stylistic choice and more like a structural limitation. In one DVD commentary, McFarlane even acknowledged the South Park critique's accuracy with a kind of self-deprecating humor, saying from a Harvard commencement speech he gave in 2006 that the cutaway gags were not in the show to advance the plot, but just for the purpose of hilarity. That is a concession that the critique was largely correct, framed as a defense of the show's right to be exactly what it is. It is a more honest position than denial would have been, and it is in many ways more interesting, because it transforms the question from whether the show is lazy to whether lazy comedy done well is its own legitimate thing. The feud between South Park and Family Guy has never been fully resolved. Both shows have continued to run long past the point where anyone expected either of them to. Both have maintained loyal audiences while generating sustained critical debate about whether their best days are behind them. And the Cartoon Wars critique has become one of the most frequently referenced pieces of inter-show commentary in the history of American animation, not because it was the funniest thing South Park ever did, but because it was one of the most specific and accurate. Section 8. The Moments That Changed History. There is a category of Family Guy controversy that sits apart from the legal battles, the watchdog campaigns, and the industry feuds. It is the category of moments that became genuinely strange in retrospect because of what happened in the real world after they aired. These are not the moments where the show was offensive and people complained. These are the moments where the show depicted something that later, in the real world, came uncomfortably close to actually occurring. The most dramatic example of this is the turban cowboy situation, which has already been covered. But there are others, and together they form a pattern that is interesting to think about. Whether or not Family Guy has ever actually predicted anything is a question that deserves more careful handling than it usually gets in internet discussions, which tend toward hyperbole in either direction. The most sober version of the argument about Family Guy's apparent predictions is that the show, like all long-running comedy programs, makes enough specific cultural references and enough jokes about enough different scenarios that some percentage of them will, purely through the mathematics of probability, correspond to things that actually happen later. The show has been running for more than 25 years. It has made thousands of jokes. If even 1% of those jokes involve a specific scenario that then plays out in some form in reality, that is still dozens of apparent predictions. This is not magic. It is not prescience. It is the inevitability of large numbers. The more interesting version of the argument is not about prediction, but about cultural sensitivity. The Boston Marathon cutaway gag in Turban Cowboy was deeply unpleasant to watch, regardless of the bombing that occurred afterward. The fact that a real attack happened at the same venue a month later transformed the context of the gag from offensive to genuinely disturbing. But the offensive quality was there before the bombing. The bombing did not create the problem with the joke. It revealed and amplified a problem that was already present. One of the most frequently discussed apparent predictions in the show's history involves a 2000 episode from season 2, in which a map is displayed that shows New York with two specific towers missing from the skyline. This was noticed after the 11th of September 2001 and was widely circulated as evidence that the show had somehow anticipated the attacks. The actual explanation is that the animation for season 2 was produced across multiple studios, and the version of the New York skyline that appeared in the episode in question had not been updated to include the World Trade Center towers, which had been completed in 1971. The absence of the towers was an animation error, not a prediction, but the circulation of the image as a prediction contributed to a broader cultural moment in which Family Guy was being discussed in connection with the September 11th attacks in a way that made everyone involved with the show uncomfortable. The show has also been discussed in connection with various pop culture deaths and events that the show had referenced in cutaway gags before they occurred. This is the large numbers problem in its most visible form. When you make enough jokes about enough celebrities over enough years, some of those celebrities will die, some of them will be involved in scandals, and some of them will do things that make the jokes look retroactively prescient. The proper interpretation of these coincidences is almost always that they are coincidences, not that the show's writers have access to information about the future. What is genuinely interesting about the apparent prediction phenomenon as it relates to Family Guy specifically is what it reveals about the show's relationship to American culture. The show draws its material almost entirely from the cultural landscape it inhabits. It makes jokes about news events, celebrities, cultural trends, and social dynamics that are present in the real world at the time the jokes are written. Because it inhabits that landscape so thoroughly and references it so constantly, it sometimes captures in comedic form tensions or dynamics that are about to break into the open in more serious ways. The Boston Marathon cutaway was not a prediction. It was a symptom of a cultural fixation on terrorism and mass casualty events that was already shaping American popular culture years before the attack happened. The difference between prediction and reflection matters enormously, and it is a distinction that gets lost when these apparent coincidences are discussed online. Family Guy is not a prophetic text. It is an uncommonly dense index of American cultural preoccupations at any given moment in the past 25 years. Reading it carefully does not tell you what is going to happen. It tells you what people were already worried about, already laughing nervously about, already turning into dark comedy as a coping mechanism. The 9/11 episode situation is worth dwelling on for a moment, because it has a more direct and acknowledged dimension beyond the skyline error. The show aired an episode called Baby on Board from season 2 that featured a scene involving planes and airports that some people found difficult to watch after the 11th of September 2001. The episode aired before the attacks, obviously, but its rerun schedule was affected by the changed cultural context, and it was among the episodes that were quietly pulled from some rerun schedules in the months following the attacks. Family Guy was not alone in this. Many television shows altered their content schedules in the aftermath of September 11th, pulling or delaying episodes that dealt with terrorism, hijackings, or mass casualty scenarios. The broader television landscape was navigating an unprecedented situation, and the calculus of what was appropriate to air shifted dramatically in a very short period. For Family Guy specifically, whose humor had always pushed in the direction of taboo subjects, the adjustment was particularly awkward. The show's entire identity was built around going where others would not go. Being forced, even temporarily, to exercise caution about specific subject matter was at odds with everything the show presented itself as. The show returned to jokes about terrorism in later seasons, most notably in the Turban Cowboy episode, and the reception to those jokes was different than it might have been before September 11th because the context in which American audiences interpreted terrorism-related humor had fundamentally changed. The show was making the same kind of jokes it had always made, but the culture receiving those jokes was not the same culture. There is also the category of apparent predictions that involve not news events but rather cultural trends. The show has, over its long run, made jokes about things that were considered far-fetched in their original context but that later became real. Some of these are small enough to be genuinely coincidental. Others are significant enough that they seem less like coincidences and more like cases of the show's writers accurately reading where culture was heading. The question of which category any specific example belongs to is rarely as clear-cut as either the show's promoters or its critics suggest. The broader point is that a show which has been running for 25 years, making specific jokes about specific aspects of American life several hundred times per season, is going to accumulate a substantial collection of moments that look strange in retrospect. Some of those moments will look strangely prescient, some will look strangely tone-deaf. Most will just look like what they are, which is jokes that made sense in the moment they were made, and that the passage of time has colored in different ways than the people who made them intended. Section 9. The Fox Network Power Struggle. If you wanted to find a relationship in Hollywood that combined professional dependency, financial entanglement, public contempt, and genuine creative tension in roughly equal measure, it would be hard to do better than the one between Seth MacFarlane and Fox. It is a relationship that has defined his career, that has shaped the trajectory of Family Guy, and that has played out in full public view in a way that is unusual, even by the standards of an industry that is unusually comfortable with airing its internal dynamics. The beginning of the story is straightforward. MacFarlane pitched Family Guy to Fox in 1998, and Fox bought it. The show premiered in 1999 and was immediately successful. It was also immediately controversial, which Fox was presumably aware was a possibility when they purchased a show from a creator who had a clear interest in pushing at the edges of what broadcast television would permit. The relationship between the show and the network in those first few seasons was not without friction, but it was functional. Fox had a hit. MacFarlane had a platform. The business case for the arrangement was clear. The first major rupture happened when Fox canceled the show. It was canceled once after Season 2, when scheduling problems consistently placed it opposite strong competition, and the ratings suffered. It came back for Season 3. After Season 3, it was canceled again. The show was off the air from 2002 to 2005. During those 3 years, the world changed in ways that affected both the show and the network. Adult Swim's rerun ratings demonstrated that the show had a devoted audience. DVD sales confirmed that the audience was large enough to be commercially significant. Fox reversed course and ordered new episodes. What is important about the cancellation history is what it did to the trust between MacFarlane and the network. MacFarlane has said in various interviews over the years that the constant cancellation and revival cycle disrupted the show's creative continuity in specific and damaging ways. Writers left. The staff had to be rebuilt. The tone shifted. Things that were working got abandoned. These were real creative costs, and they were costs that MacFarlane attributed directly to Fox's decisions about the show's scheduling and its value to the network. The tension was not just about the cancellations. It was also about the ongoing relationship between Family Guy and Fox News. Fox Broadcasting, which airs Family Guy, and Fox News, which airs conservative political commentary, are under the same corporate umbrella, though they operate as separate entities. For MacFarlane, a vocal liberal who has been consistently outspoken about his political views, working for a network that shares a name with a news organization he found deeply objectionable, was a persistent source of discomfort. He said publicly in 2018, in a tweet that he later deleted, that he was embarrassed to work for this company, responding to a moment when Tucker Carlson had told his viewers to distrust mainstream news sources. MacFarlane wrote that the comment translated to not thinking critically, not consulting multiple sources, and just blindly obeying Fox News. He called it fringe material. Fox Broadcasting declined to respond publicly to the tweet. In January 2020, MacFarlane signed a 5-year deal with NBC Universal's Universal Content Productions that was reported to be worth approximately $200 million. The deal moved him away from 20th Century Fox Television, which had been his studio home for 20 years, and into the Comcast ecosystem. It was a significant and deliberate professional realignment. His newer shows, including The Orville, which moved from Fox to Hulu, and the Ted prequel series, were being developed and distributed outside the Fox system. Family Guy remained on Fox because the show's rights were controlled by 20th Century Fox Television, which became part of Disney after Disney's acquisition of the larger Fox Entertainment assets in 2019. The arrangement that followed is genuinely unusual. MacFarlane signed a massive deal with a competitor of the company that owns his most famous show. He continued to voice all of his characters on Family Guy, fulfilling his contractual obligations to appear in the recording booth for every episode. But the creative direction of the show was in the hands of showrunners rather than in his own, and he continued to publicly express his displeasure at Family Guy being associated with Fox News. The most pointed public expression of this came in August 2021, when MacFarlane tweeted his now famous comparison of the relationship to a failing marriage. Tucker Carlson's latest opinion piece once again makes me wish Family Guy was on any other network, he wrote. Look, Fox, we both know this marriage isn't working anymore. The sex is only once a year. I don't get along with your mother, and, well, I've been having an affair with NBC. Fox Entertainment president Michael Thorne responded by telling reporters that Fox had the shows for a few more years and expected to keep them as part of the network's animation strategy. He was not particularly distressed by MacFarlane's tweet. The episode of Fox history that most directly affected Family Guy before the long-running tension with MacFarlane was the 2007 Writers Guild of America strike. This was a major labor action in which television and film writers refused to work for approximately 3 months, from November 2007 to the 12th of February 2008, over disputes about payment for DVD sales and digital distribution. MacFarlane was a strong supporter of the writers and joined the picket lines. During the strike, Fox made the decision to air 3 Family Guy episodes that had been completed before the strike began. They had the contractual right to do this since the episodes were finished. But airing them against MacFarlane's wishes generated real anger, and it was a specific, concrete example of Fox exercising its ownership of the show in a way that MacFarlane found objectionable. In 2023, the Writers Guild went on strike again. MacFarlane, along with Family Guy showrunners Rich Appel and Alex Sulkin, made clear that they would not work on their shows while the strike was ongoing. MacFarlane was visible on the picket line. The strike lasted several months and disrupted the production schedules of Family Guy and American Dad. The disruption was not as severe as the 2007 strike had been, but it added another chapter to the ongoing story of the relationship between the show, its creator, and the labor dynamics of the industry that produced both of them. In April 2025, an announcement came that Family Guy had secured a renewal deal with parent company Disney that would carry the show through its 27th season and into the 2028 to 2029 television season. Each season under the new deal would consist of 15 episodes. The show that had been canceled twice in its first 3 seasons was now locked in for years into the future, regardless of ratings, regardless of critical opinion, and regardless of the complicated feelings of the man who created it. That outcome is the strange coda to a strange relationship, because it confirms that the economic logic of the show has completely decoupled from the creative and personal dimensions of the story. MacFarlane's comments about the show in recent years have been notably different in tone from the passion he expressed about it in the early years. He has framed the show's continued existence primarily in terms of financial utility, noting that it helps fund causes he cares about like environmental conservation. He has acknowledged that there was a time when he thought it was time to wrap things up. He has described the show as having reached escape velocity, meaning it has been running so long that there is no obvious logical reason to stop. He has not, in the same interviews, described exciting new creative directions he wants to explore with the characters he spent decades building. That shift in how the creator talks about his creation is one of the saddest dimensions of this whole story. Not because there is anything wrong with a successful show continuing to air, but because the distance between the young man who pitched a 15-minute pilot to Fox in 1998 with genuine excitement about the world he wanted to create, and the successful producer who describes his most famous show primarily as a revenue source for good causes, tells you everything you need to know about what happens when a creative endeavor becomes primarily a commercial one. Section 10. The Political Firestorms. Family Guy has always had a complicated relationship with political commentary. The show makes political jokes. It always has. But the nature of those jokes and what they reveal about the show's political perspective has been a subject of sustained debate across the show's entire run. In the early seasons, the political humor was relatively balanced in its approach, or at least perceived that way. The show made jokes about politicians and policies from multiple directions. It used political material as one ingredient in a broader comedic mix, without leaning too heavily in any single direction. As the show went on, particularly after the revival in 2005, and through the years when Brian's character became increasingly associated with liberal political positions, that balance shifted. Brian became the show's primary vehicle for political commentary, and Brian's politics were clearly aligned with those of a specific kind of educated, secular, left-leaning American. The jokes he made about conservative politics, about religion, about social issues, were the jokes of someone who had already decided which side he was on, and was expressing frustration with the other side rather than engaging with it. The response from viewers who disagreed with those politics was significant and ongoing. Conservative critics argued that the show used its platform to push a particular political agenda, and that it did so in a format, animation aimed at adults, that was especially influential because of how it reached younger audiences. They pointed to episodes where the political commentary was less integrated into the comedy and more like the show stopping to deliver a lecture. These criticisms had some merit. There were episodes, particularly in the middle seasons, where Brian's political speeches felt less like organic character dialogue and more like the writers of the show using their creation as a megaphone. MacFarlane himself was not shy about his political views. He made significant political donations. He spoke at political fundraisers. He used his personal social media platforms to comment on political developments, with the kind of regularity and directness that is unusual for a figure at his level of commercial success. That personal political visibility made it harder for the show's defenders to argue that Family Guy's political content was purely satirical and not ideological. When the creator of the show is visibly aligned with a particular political perspective, the argument that the show itself has no political perspective becomes difficult to sustain. The show's treatment of specific political figures generated individual controversies across its run. The Sarah Palin situation has already been covered. But there were many others. A 2017 episode depicted Steve Bannon, who was serving as a senior advisor to President Donald Trump at the time, in a way that generated substantial coverage. Episodes during the Obama presidency made jokes about both the president and his administration. Episodes during the Bush years were often pointed in their criticism of Bush-era policies. The show has always been more comfortable making political jokes about figures and positions that align with conservative politics than about those that align with liberal politics, and that imbalance has been noted by critics of various political orientations. The Venezuelan ban, which centered on the marijuana legalization episode from Season 7, represents the show's most internationally significant political controversy and deserves more attention than it usually gets in discussions of the show's controversies. The episode called 420, which aired on the 19th of April 2009, followed Brian's arrest for marijuana possession and his subsequent campaign to legalize the drug in the fictional town where the show is set. The episode included a musical number called A Bag of Weed, performed by Brian and Stewie to the tune of Me Ol' Bamboo from the film Chitty Chitty Bang Bang, in which the characters enthusiastically promoted cannabis use. In September 2009, Venezuelan Justice Minister Tarek El Aissami publicly criticized the episode, calling it an endorsement of drug use and a tool of American pro-drug propaganda. Under President Hugo Chavez, Venezuela had been developing increasingly strict regulations on both its broadcast media and its content standards, and El Aissami's comments were followed quickly by a directive to private television stations to stop airing Family Guy. Stations that continued broadcasting the show were threatened with financial sanctions from Venezuela's telecommunications regulator. One station, Televen, reportedly avoided a fine by replacing Family Guy with an episode of Baywatch. The Venezuelan government framed the ban as part of its anti-narcotic stance and specifically in the context of its ongoing dispute with the United States government over drug trafficking policy. American drug consumption, El Aissami argued, was fueling Venezuela's narco-trafficking market, and adult cartoons like Family Guy were mouthpieces for the American government's tolerant attitude toward drugs. The Parents Television Council, which had also objected to the episode, rated a June 2009 re-airing as their worst TV show of the week for its emphasis on the legality of cannabis. This created the unusual situation in which an American conservative advocacy organization and the government of Hugo Chavez were, at least superficially, aligned in their objection to the same piece of television programming. Neither organization would have welcomed the comparison. The ban in Venezuela attracted significant coverage in the American media, which treated it primarily as an example of government overreach rather than as a serious critique of the episode's content. McFarlane and the show's team did not comment extensively on the Venezuelan ban at the time, though it was noted with some amusement that the country had previously banned The Simpsons for being unsuitable for children, which meant Venezuela was developing a significant record of objections to American animated comedies. The show's political content has also generated sustained controversy in the form of accusations of racism, which are distinct from but related to the political controversies. The show has made jokes about virtually every racial and ethnic group, and some of those jokes have been criticized as perpetuating harmful stereotypes rather than satirizing them. The debate about whether depicting a stereotype in comedy, even for the purpose of satirizing it, reinforces or challenges the stereotype is a genuine and unresolved one in media criticism. Family Guy sits at the center of that debate in a way that no amount of executive producer statements about the show's true intentions can fully resolve. The most recent major political controversy involving the show at the time of writing involves the show's depiction of Russia and Russian characters in its most recent seasons, which generated concerns about whether the show might be banned in Russia as well, following the diplomatic tensions between the United States and Russia. That situation ultimately did not result in a ban, but it demonstrated that even in its later seasons, Family Guy retained the capacity to generate the kind of international political attention that had previously been associated primarily with its earlier, more culturally dominant period. Section 11. Inside the Writer's Room. The controversies that get the most attention are the ones that have public faces. The lawsuits, the bans, the celebrity complaints, the government bans. These are the controversies that make news because they have clear antagonists and clear outcomes. But some of the most significant controversies in Family Guy's history happened inside the building, in the writer's room, in the recording studio, in the editorial meetings where decisions were made about what the show would say and how it would say it. These interior controversies are harder to document precisely because they happened without press releases, but they have left traces in the show's output and in the public statements of people who were involved with its production. The writing staff of Family Guy has changed dramatically across the show's run. In the early seasons, McFarlane assembled a specific group of writers who helped establish the tone and voice of the show. Names like Chris Sheridan, Danny Smith, Gary Janetti, Neil Goldman, Garrett Donovan, and Mike Barker were central to the show's early identity. These writers shared a sensibility, a way of thinking about comedy, that came through in the consistency of the show's voice across the first 3 seasons. The cancellations disrupted that group. When a show gets canceled, writers find other work. They sign contracts with other shows, go to other networks, develop their own projects. By the time Family Guy came back in 2005, the original writing team had largely dispersed, and the show that returned had a different collection of voices behind it. McFarlane has talked about this openly, describing the constant cancellation and revival cycle as having created a perpetual restaffing problem. Every time the show was pulled and then brought back, new writers had to be brought in who had not been part of building the show's identity in the first place. The evolution of the show's content under different writing staffs is visible in the output. The character of Meg's treatment, for example, which started as gentle unpopularity and escalated over seasons into something more disturbing, reflects the cumulative choices of multiple different writing teams rather than a single deliberate decision. The escalation happened gradually because each new group of writers inherited the previous group's choices and pushed them slightly further. There was no single moment when a room full of people decided to make Meg a target of sustained abuse. It happened through accretion, one season at a time. The shift in how women were represented in the writing staff itself has been discussed in connection with the Meg storyline. By season 14 and 15, there were more women writing for Family Guy than there had been in earlier seasons, and critics and fans noticed that the treatment of Meg began to soften around the same time. The extreme abuse began to decrease. Meg was given storylines where she demonstrated competence and resilience. The character who had spent roughly 10 seasons being used as a target began to be allowed to be something more. The connection between the composition of the writing staff and the content of the show was not exactly hidden. McFarlane did not discuss it explicitly in those terms publicly, but the correlation was clear enough that commentators pointed it out. The departure of certain specific writers has also been documented as significant. Danny Smith, who wrote some of the show's most carefully crafted episodes, including the banned partial terms of endearment episode, worked on the show through multiple seasons and was associated with some of the show's strongest character-driven writing. His presence in a given season is sometimes noted by fans who track the quality of individual episodes across the show's run. Writers come and go from television shows for many reasons, including opportunities elsewhere, contract disputes, creative disagreements, and simple career decisions. And the public record does not usually contain detailed information about why specific individuals left specific shows at specific times. What can be said with confidence is that the Family Guy writers' room has always been a high-pressure environment. The show operates on an aggressive production schedule, the kind of schedule that is common in animation, where the long lead times of the production process require writers to be planning episodes that will air nearly a year in the future. The combination of high output volume and the show's specific style of humor, which requires generating large numbers of jokes quickly and having them be genuinely funny rather than just technically proficient, creates a working environment that is demanding in specific ways. McFarlane's own engagement with the day-to-day writing became less intensive over time as he took on more outside projects. The transition of show-running responsibilities to Rich Appel and Alex Sulkin was a significant structural change in how the show operated, even though McFarlane continued to voice his characters. The showrunners have spoken publicly about the show on various occasions, and their comments reveal a team that is deeply aware of the show's history and of the fan community's evolving relationship with it, but that also operates with significant autonomy in deciding what stories to tell and how to tell them. One aspect of the show's internal controversies that has occasionally surfaced in public discussion is the question of how the show makes decisions about which targets are in bounds and which are out of bounds. The show's defenders have always maintained that nothing is off the table, that equal opportunity offense is the show's organizing principle, and that the willingness to make jokes about everything is actually a form of fairness. But the show's actual record, examined carefully, reveals patterns in who gets targeted how often and with what intensity that complicate the equal opportunity argument. The treatment of women, particularly Lois in the later seasons, but most visibly Meg across a sustained period, reflects choices made over multiple seasons by multiple writing teams that moved in a consistent direction. The treatment of Joe Swanson's disability as an increasingly mean-spirited punchline in later seasons reflects similar choices. These patterns are hard to reconcile with the claim that the show treats all targets equally. They suggest that the show was more comfortable making certain kinds of jokes about certain kinds of targets than others, and that the cultural context in which the show was produced shaped those choices in ways that its creators did not always acknowledge. The show has also been at the center of debates about appropriation and voice, specifically about who has the right to make jokes about experiences they do not share. These debates have intensified in American culture in recent years, and Family Guy's long catalog of jokes about various racial, ethnic, and disability communities has been revisited in light of those debates. The show's responses to this kind of criticism have generally been to defend its approach as satire rather than engagement, and to point to the show's overall record of equal opportunity offense as sufficient context. Whether that defense holds up to scrutiny depends significantly on which specific jokes you are examining and whose experience of those jokes you consider authoritative. What the internal history of Family Guy's writing staff ultimately reveals is that the show's controversies were not the product of a single creative vision consistently applied across 25 years. They were the accumulated output of dozens of writers over multiple decades, working within a system that had certain structural tendencies that pushed in specific directions. Some of those tendencies produced brilliant comedy. Some of them produced content that the show's own participants later regretted. And some of them produced the lawsuits, bans, and federal complaints that make up the public record of one of the most controversial television shows in American history. Section 12. The Legacy of Chaos. If you tried to summarize the full history of Family Guy's controversies in a single sentence, you would fail. The history is too long, too varied, and too contradictory for any single sentence to hold it. You would need multiple sentences, or a few hours worth of careful narration, which is what you have been listening to. But there are a few things that emerge clearly from looking at the whole picture at once. The first is that Family Guy's controversies are not, for the most part, separate isolated incidents. They are chapters in a continuous story about what it means for a creative work to operate at the edges of what a culture will permit. Every time the show pushed too far and something was banned or pulled or sued over, it learned something about where the edges were. Every time it pushed and nothing happened, it learned something about how much room it actually had. That ongoing negotiation between the show and its cultural context is what shaped Family Guy across its run, and the controversies are the visible traces of that negotiation. The second thing that emerges is that Seth MacFarlane's own story is inseparable from the show's controversies, even in the periods when he was less directly involved in its day-to-day production. His politics, his public statements, his professional decisions, his personal relationships, and his singular Oscars joke all became part of the show's story because he and the show were understood by the public as essentially the same entity. That is true of most creator-driven works in ways that are both fair and unfair, and the Family Guy story is a particularly clear example of how the controversies around a creator and the controversies around their creation inform and complicate each other. The third thing is that the show's relationship with its audience was fundamentally altered by the Brian Griffin death and resurrection arc, even more than by any of the legal battles or governmental bans. The Burnett lawsuit settled quietly. The Venezuelan ban became a footnote. The South Park critique became part of the show's own mythology. But the Brian death revealed something about the show's relationship with its audience that did not go away. It showed that the audience was still capable of genuine emotional investment in the characters, even after years of watching the show treat those characters with increasing carelessness. And then it showed that the show was not willing to sustain the consequences of its own boldest creative decisions. That combination, evidence of what the show could still mean to people, and evidence of the show's unwillingness to live up to what it could mean, is the defining tension of Family Guy's later years. The fourth thing is about the show's competitors. American Dad, the show that was supposed to be Family Guy's lesser sibling, has over time demonstrated that the things wrong with Family Guy in its later seasons were choices, not inevitabilities. A show can run for decades without systematically brutalizing one of its main characters. A show can rely on character-driven stories without leaning on interchangeable cutaway gags. A show can keep its lead character recognizably human without flanderizing him into someone unpleasant. American Dad did those things while Family Guy did not, and that comparison is the most damning piece of context for understanding what went wrong. The fifth and perhaps most poignant thing is the arc of MacFarlane's own feelings about the show. The young creator who had poured his energy into a 15-minute pilot because he wanted to make something that mattered, who had fought to get the show back from cancellation twice because he believed in what it was, who had stood on picket lines to protect the writers because he understood that the show's quality depended on them. That person describes his creation in his recent public statements primarily as a revenue source and a financial vehicle. That is not a failure or a character flaw. It is what happens when any creative endeavor exists long enough and becomes successful enough. The commercial dimension eventually grows large enough to cast a shadow over everything else. But it is worth noticing, because it explains the gap between what Family Guy was in its best moments and what it became in its most recent ones. The controversies will not stop. As long as Family Guy is on the air, it will do things that make people angry. It will make jokes that get pulled in some countries. It will depict real people in ways that annoy their lawyers. It will push on topics that organized groups believe should not be pushed on. It will do all of this because that is what it was built to do, and because the structural logic of the show rewards doing it. The form creates the incentive, and the incentive creates the content. What has changed is not the controversy. What has changed is what the controversy is for. In the early seasons, every controversial moment was in service of something. The show was pushing on the culture because it had things to say about the culture. The offense was not the point. The point was behind the offense, visible to anyone who was paying attention. In the later seasons, more and more often, the offense became the point itself. The shock was the destination rather than a vehicle for something more interesting. That is the real story of Family Guy's controversies. Not the lawsuits, not the bans, not the FCC complaints. The real story is the shift from a show that used controversy as a creative tool to a show that used it as a substitute for creativity. And the reason that shift matters is that it represents the same thing Family Guy at its best was always criticizing: the tendency to confuse loudness with meaning, spectacle with substance, and making people react with making them think. Family Guy has made millions of people react across more than 25 years. It has made far fewer of them think than it used to. And it has generated a record of scandal and controversy that would take several hours to tell completely, which is exactly what we have just done. Thank you for spending this time with all of it. Sleep well, and if you made it this far, you have officially survived the full oral history of one of the most chaotic shows in television history. If you enjoyed spending this time going through all of this, and if stories like this are what you come here for, please do hit subscribe. It genuinely helps keep the channel going, and it means more of these long, slow, detailed stories are coming your way. Take care of yourselves. End of script. Section 13. The Sarah Palin Battle and the Disability Debate. There are controversies that burn hot for a week and then disappear, and there are controversies that expose something deep and unresolved in the culture that produced them. The Family Guy episode called Extra Large Medium, which aired on Valentine's Day, the 14th of February 2010, belongs to the second category. It generated headlines for weeks, drew responses from national political figures, sparked a significant debate about disability representation in comedy, and produced one of the most unexpected and memorable public statements to come out of any Family Guy controversy from a person that almost nobody expected to hear from. The episode's main plot follows Chris Griffin going on a date with a girl named Ellen who has Down syndrome. The character of Ellen was voiced by a woman named Andrea Faye Friedman, who is 39 years old and who herself was born with Down syndrome. Friedman had worked in television for nearly 2 decades at the point when she was cast in the episode, with appearances on Life Goes On, ER, Saving Grace, and Seventh Heaven among her credits. She had been sought out specifically for the role because the show's creators wanted someone with actual experience of Down syndrome to voice the character. The episode also included a brief moment in which Ellen mentions that her mother is the former governor of Alaska, a line that was clearly designed as a joke about Sarah Palin, whose son Trig had been born with Down syndrome in April 2008. Palin's response came quickly. She posted on Facebook calling the episode a kick in the gut. She appeared on Fox News Channel's The O'Reilly Factor and said that the world was full of cruel, cold-hearted people who would do such a thing, and she asked directly when enough was enough, and when people would be willing to say that some things just were not funny. Her daughter Bristol made a separate public statement saying that if the writers of a particularly pathetic cartoon show thought they were being clever in mocking her brother and her family, they had failed. Both the mother and daughter framed the episode as an attack specifically on Trig, rather than as political satire aimed at Palin as a public figure. Seth MacFarlane responded in an interview with the Los Angeles Times, saying that the show always uses satire as the basis of its humor, and that Family Guy is an equal opportunity offender. He pointed to the show's long history of making jokes about virtually every public figure and every group as context for the Palin reference. The show's writer Steve Callahan addressed the controversy at San Diego Comic-Con in July 2010 with a quip that received significant coverage. He said that in the upcoming season, he had decided to even things out and write something that would offend smart people. But the response that received the most attention and that has lasted the longest in the cultural memory of this controversy was not from MacFarlane, and it was not from Callahan. It was from Andrea Faye Friedman herself. In an email that she sent to the New York Times and that was widely republished across the internet, Friedman wrote a direct response to Palin's criticism. She said that she guessed the former governor did not have a sense of humor. She noted that she thought the line about being the daughter of the former governor of Alaska was very funny. She wrote that she thought the word being looked for was sarcasm. She said that her family believed in laughing and had raised her to have a sense of humor and live a normal life. And then she delivered the line that became the most quoted thing to come out of this entire controversy. She wrote that her mother did not carry her around under her arm like a loaf of French bread, the way former Governor Palin carried her son Trig around looking for sympathy and votes. That sentence, written by a 39-year-old woman with Down syndrome who had worked in television for nearly 2 decades, effectively ended the public conversation about the episode on terms that were deeply unfavorable to Palin. The argument that the episode mocked people with Down syndrome had been made by Palin on the assumption that she was speaking for that community. Friedman's response demonstrated that she was not. The actor who had actually given voice to the character, who knew what it was to live with Down syndrome rather than simply to be the parent of a child who had it, said the episode was funny and that the objection to it reflected a lack of sense of humor. The deeper debate that the episode sparked was not resolved by Friedman's statement, because it touched on questions that do not have clean answers. Whether comedy about disability helps normalize disability by including disabled people in the subjects that culture finds funny, or whether it perpetuates negative associations that cause real harm to disabled people, is a question that genuine, thoughtful people disagree about. The disability rights community itself is not monolithic in its position on comedy as representation. Some advocates argue that any depiction of disability for comedic purposes is inherently dehumanizing. Others argue that excluding disabled people from the subjects of comedy is itself a form of othering, a way of saying that certain experiences are too serious to laugh about, and that the people who have them are therefore outside the range of normal human experience. Family Guy's approach to disability has never been consistent enough to be clearly on one side or the other of that debate. The show has made jokes about disabilities that seem designed primarily to get a reaction from the shock of the subject matter. It has also told stories involving characters with disabilities, like Joe Swanson and his wheelchair, that while sometimes problematic in their later seasons contain genuine moments of humanity. The extra-large medium episode is, by most critical assessments, actually one of the better examples of the show engaging with disability in a way that had a point beyond the shock. The Down syndrome character was not simply a punchline. She had personality. She was played by someone with the same condition. The joke about Palin was political satire rather than mockery of Down syndrome itself. Whether Palin was right to object or wrong to object depends on a set of questions about intent and impact that the episode's content alone cannot resolve. What the controversy did definitively establish was that Family Guy's reach into American political culture was significant enough that when the show made a single-sentence reference to a national political figure, it could generate a multi-week news cycle involving that figure personally. That is a kind of cultural power that very few entertainment properties possess. Section 14. The Simpsons crossover and the history of their rivalry. Before Family Guy ever aired, the animated comedy series that dominated Sunday night primetime and that defined the genre of adult animated television was The Simpsons. Matt Groening's creation had premiered in December 1989 and had established itself across the early 1990s as arguably the most critically acclaimed comedy on American television. When Family Guy premiered in January 1999, comparisons to The Simpsons were immediate and almost universally unflattering to Family Guy. Critics called it a poor imitation. Some observers pointed to specific character similarities. Both shows featured a dim-witted father, a smart wife, and eccentric children. Both were animated. Both used the format of the family sitcom as a frame for social commentary. MacFarlane had always been somewhat defensive about the comparison. He had consistently argued that the shows were doing fundamentally different things, that Family Guy was not trying to be The Simpsons and did not deserve to be evaluated as though it were. That argument is fair in many respects. The shows are genuinely different in their approaches. The Simpsons built its comedy on consistent characterization and sharp satirical writing. Family Guy built its comedy on random cultural references and cutaway gags. The tones are different, the rhythms are different, the ways in which they fail when they fail are different. But the comparison lingered because both shows were animated adult comedies that aired on Fox on Sunday nights, and because Family Guy's revival in 2005 placed it directly in competition with The Simpsons for the same audience and the same cultural real estate. The Simpsons team's response, when South Park made fun of Family Guy in 2006, was reportedly to send flowers. That is not a response from people who view the other show as a peer. It is a response from people who have been waiting for someone to say publicly what they have been thinking privately. The relationship between the two shows became more complex over the years, and in 2014 it produced one of the most anticipated and most divisive moments in both shows' histories. The crossover episode, in which the Griffin family and the Simpson family exist in the same universe and interact directly, had been rumored for years before it happened. When it finally aired on the 28th of September 2014, it was titled The Simpsons Guy, and it drew approximately 8.97 million viewers, making it one of the highest-rated Family Guy episodes in years and one of the highest-rated Simpsons episodes in its recent run at that point. The episode's premise placed the Griffin family in Springfield after they were run out of their own town. The two families meet. The two fathers bond over their shared tendency toward stupidity. Peter and Homer eventually have a fight that goes on for an extraordinarily long time. A joke about both shows' respective histories of running gags past the point of reason. Stewie interacts with Bart. Meg meets Lisa. The critical reception was mixed. Many viewers found the meeting of the two universes satisfying in the way that long-awaited crossover events often are, simply because they happened at all. Others found the episode's jokes about each show at the other's expense more interesting than the actual crossover plot, which by necessity could not meaningfully advance the continuity of either show. The episode had to leave both worlds exactly as they found them, which meant it was fundamentally a self-contained experience with high production value and the emotional weight of a reunion tour. The rape joke in the promotional trailer, which the PTC objected to before the episode aired, added a pre-broadcast controversy to an episode that had been generating anticipation for months. The joke involved Stewie making a prank call to Moe's Tavern that included a reference to sexual assault. PTC President Tim Winter wrote to Groening and McFarlane and to Fox, arguing that the joke would be seen by children who watched The Simpsons but were unfamiliar with Family Guy's brand of humor, and that jokes about sexual violence normalized the thing they depicted. McFarlane's response was to describe the joke as pretty funny, while acknowledging that he expected to be attacked for saying so. The deeper significance of the crossover, in the context of Family Guy's controversies, is what it revealed about how the two shows' cultural positions had shifted by 2014. When Family Guy first aired, it was the upstart that critics dismissed as a Simpsons knockoff. By 2014, Family Guy had been on the air for 15 years, had built its own devoted audience, and was considered important enough for The Simpsons to agree to share a universe with it for a single episode. That is a form of validation that the show's early critics would not have predicted. The rivalry had evolved from dismissal into something more like reluctant mutual acknowledgement. Section 15. The show's darkest moments, and what they cost. Every long-running comedy eventually produces episodes that its creators, with the benefit of hindsight, probably wish they had made differently. These are not necessarily the episodes that generated the most controversy at the time. Sometimes the most controversially discussed episodes are not the ones that were actually handled worst. And sometimes the episodes that barely generated public controversy are the ones that, looking back, represent genuine failures of judgment or craft. Family Guy has a catalog of episodes that fall into the genuinely handled badly category, episodes where the comedy was so poorly calibrated to its subject matter that the show was clearly causing harm without sufficient purpose. The episode called Screams of Silence, the story of Brenda Q, is widely considered the most obvious example of this. The episode aired in Season 10 in 2011 and centered on Quagmire's sister Brenda, who is in an abusive relationship. The show spent the episode playing the abuse for laughs in a way that struck critics and advocates as deeply irresponsible, given the real-world stakes of domestic violence. A.J. Hammer of CNN's Showbiz Tonight described it as something he was just shocked by and called it a depressing half-hour of television. Whitney Jefferson of the feminist website Jezebel wrote that she was way beyond being offended by the show but found the domestic violence episode seriously awful, describing it as the scariest Halloween special she had ever seen. What made the Screams of Silence episode particularly troubling was not just that it made jokes about domestic violence. Comedy has addressed domestic violence before, sometimes effectively and sometimes not. What was troubling was the specific framing the episode used, in which the domestic violence was consistently depicted as the woman's problem to solve, rather than the abuser's crime to answer for, and in which humor was derived from the suffering of the victim rather than from any larger satirical point about how society handles domestic violence. The episode did not appear to have a perspective on its subject. It appeared to be using domestic abuse as set dressing for jokes that could have been hung on any sufficiently dire scenario. The show has also been criticized for its handling of sexual violence, most notably in the episode Screams of Silence, and in several other episodes where rape is referenced in cutaway gags. The PTC specifically called for FCC complaints in February 2015 over what it described as a rape episode, and The Hollywood Reporter covered the PTC's campaign in a story that detailed the specific content that had prompted the complaint. There is a broader pattern here that is worth naming explicitly. Family Guy has, over its run, treated sexual violence as comedy material in ways that differ from how it treats other forms of violence. Physical violence in the show, from Peter's fights with the giant chicken to the graphic gore that appeared in later seasons, is depicted with a kind of cartoon remove that signals to the audience that they are watching exaggerated unreality. Sexual violence, when it appears in the show's humor, does not always receive the same tonal treatment. Some critics have argued that this inconsistency reflects a broader cultural tendency to treat sexual violence differently from other violence, in ways that normalize the former rather than interrogating it. The most sustained criticism of the show's treatment of women comes from the Meg storyline, which has been covered extensively in previous sections, but it is worth returning to here in the context of the show's darkest moments, because the cumulative effect of the Meg abuse over approximately 10 seasons is genuinely difficult to account for simply as comedy. The show made a character who is the only young woman in its central family the target of sustained, escalating abuse that was played for laughs. The message embedded in that decade of comedy, regardless of the intentions behind it, was that a teenage girl's suffering is inherently funny, and that her suffering is justified by some quality in her that makes her deserving of it. The episode Seahorse Seashell Party from Season 10 is the episode that made this dimension of the show most explicit. In the episode, Meg finally confronts her family about how they have treated her. Her speech is powerful, specific, and accurate. It describes real things that have happened to her character on the show. And then the episode resolves by having Meg take back everything she said and willingly return to her role as the family's punching bag, because without her absorbing all of the family's frustrations, they would turn on each other. The episode's conclusion is essentially an argument that victims of sustained abuse should accept that role because it serves a stabilizing function for the people who are abusing them. That argument is the kind of thing that, when stated explicitly in a narrative, draws immediate and intense criticism. When it is embedded in an animated comedy, it can pass without the same scrutiny. But the argument is there, and it was made by the show's writers deliberately. What the darker moments in Family Guy's catalog reveal is that the show's creative philosophy of equal opportunity offense broke down in specific and patterned ways. The offense was not actually equal. Some targets were hit harder, more frequently, and with less craft than others. The targets who got hit hardest and with least justification tended to be the ones with the least power in the world outside the show: a teenage girl, a man in a wheelchair, people with disabilities, domestic violence victims. The show's defenders often respond to this observation by pointing to the many episodes that do treat these subjects with genuine care and craft. But the existence of better episodes does not erase the worse ones. It just makes the contrast more visible. Section 16. The show that wouldn't end and the culture that keeps watching it. There is something genuinely strange about the position Family Guy occupies in contemporary American culture. The show has been running for more than 25 years. Its ratings have declined so dramatically that the version currently airing is watched by a fraction of the audience that tuned in during its peak. Its creator has publicly expressed his wish to be on a different network. Its main character has become, in the assessment of many longtime fans, the opposite of what made him beloved. And yet the show continues to be renewed, to be watched, to generate controversy, and to maintain a presence in the cultural conversation that is entirely disproportionate to its current ratings. In April 2025, the announcement came that Family Guy had secured a renewal deal with Disney, the parent company of 20th Century Fox Television, that would take the show through its 27th season and into the 2028 to 2029 television season. The deal guaranteed 15 episodes per season. It was described as a mega deal. By that point, Family Guy had been renewed for more seasons beyond what most observers had expected for years. The economics of the decision were clear to anyone paying attention. Animated shows are cheap to produce relative to live-action dramas. Family Guy has enormous value in reruns and on streaming platforms. It generates licensing revenue. The show's name is a brand that has decades of accumulated recognition behind it. None of that value depends on how many people watch new episodes on Wednesday nights. The cultural question that this situation raises is interesting and does not have a satisfying answer. What does it mean for a piece of art, or entertainment, or both, to continue existing long after the conditions that made it meaningful have changed? Family Guy in its first 3 seasons was doing something that nothing else was doing. It had a specific creative vision, a specific voice, a specific set of characters that felt genuinely new. That version of the show earned the loyalty of the audience that grew up with it, and still returns to those early episodes for comfort and nostalgia in the way that people return to the music they loved in adolescence. The version of Family Guy that airs today is a different artifact. It is made by a largely different team of people, aired on a different night of the week than it was built for, watched by far fewer people, and evaluated by its creator primarily in terms of its financial utility. The characters share names and visual designs with the characters from the early seasons, but their personalities, their relationships, and the kinds of stories told about them have all changed in ways that most longtime fans of the show do not find improvements. And yet people still watch it. Not as many people, and perhaps not with the same investment they once brought to it, but they watch it. The show generates enough cultural commentary, enough Twitter discussion, enough fan debate, that it maintains a presence in the conversation. Some of that presence comes from the ongoing controversies, the moments that still manage to generate the kind of reaction that new episodes use to reliably produce. There is a specific relationship between nostalgia and controversy that Family Guy exploits, sometimes deliberately and sometimes accidentally. The show's reputation was built on its controversial moments, and that reputation persists even in periods when the show is producing relatively little that is genuinely controversial by the standards of its own history. When a new episode does something that generates strong reactions, those reactions are amplified by the background radiation of everything the show has done before. A controversy in Family Guy's 22nd season is read against the context of 21 previous seasons of controversies. The show carries its history with it, and that history is full of banned episodes and government bans and federal complaints and dead and resurrected characters and Oscar jokes and feuds with South Park. That history is part of what makes each new moment interesting. The audience that watches Family Guy today is not the same as the audience that watched it in 1999. The 22 million people who watched the pilot after the Super Bowl were watching the show as a new and surprising thing. Many of the people who watch it now are watching it from a complicated mixture of genuine enjoyment, habit, nostalgia, and a kind of loyalty to something they grew up with that persists even as the thing itself has changed. That complicated relationship between audiences and aging cultural properties is not unique to Family Guy. It is the condition of almost every piece of popular culture that outlives its golden period. But Family Guy is an unusually clear example of it because the distance between what the show was at its best and what it has become is so visible and so widely discussed by the very audience that continues to watch it. The controversies that this script has traced across 15 sections are the backbone of Family Guy's cultural identity. They are what made it famous, what kept it in the conversation during periods when its quality was declining, what gave it material to satirize about itself in its own self-aware later episodes, and what will ultimately be the primary thing remembered about it when it is finally gone. Not the funniest jokes, not the most touching moments, not the most inventive episodes, but the controversies. The banned episodes, the lawsuits, the FCC complaints, the time the dog died and then didn't, the Oscar joke that turned out to be something real, the feud with South Park, the Venezuelan president who threatened cable stations with fines. All of it is part of the same story, the story of a show that was built around the idea of saying the things that television was not supposed to say, that spent more than 25 years doing exactly that, and that in the process became one of the most controversial pieces of entertainment that American popular culture has produced in the modern era. Whether it was worth it, whether the controversies served genuine artistic and social purposes, or whether they were more often about shock for its own sake, is a question that the show itself never resolved. It kept asking the question by keeping the controversies coming, and the culture kept watching, kept complaining, kept filing complaints with the FCC and with the Catholic League and with the Parents Television Council, kept starting petitions on change.org to bring back dead dogs, kept arguing on the internet about whether the new episodes were as good as the old ones, kept doing everything that an engaged and passionate audience does with a piece of culture that matters to them. That engagement, contentious and complicated and often critical as it is its own kind of tribute. The shows that nobody cares about do not generate 188,000 FCC complaints. They do not get banned by South American governments. They do not produce national conversations about disability representation and political satire. They do not make their creator wish they were on a different network while also guaranteeing him enough income to fund conservation organizations. The controversies are not separate from Family Guy's success. They are its success, inseparable from it, and they will outlast the show itself. Section 17. Characters that became controversy themselves. One dimension of Family Guy's cultural footprint that often gets separated from the main controversy narrative is the way in which individual characters became lightning rods for specific kinds of criticism that then attached to the show as a whole. This is different from specific episodes generating backlash. This is about the ongoing existence of recurring characters whose presence in the show embodied arguments about what kinds of humor were acceptable. Glenn Quagmire is the clearest example of this phenomenon. Quagmire is one of Peter's closest friends, a pilot who has been a recurring character since the show's earliest seasons. He is characterized primarily by his hypersexuality and his aggressive pursuit of women, often depicted engaging in or referencing behavior that, in a realistic context, would constitute sexual harassment or assault. In the earliest seasons, Quagmire's behavior was presented as a form of exaggerated, cartoon-logic raunchiness, the kind of thing that works in an animated comedy precisely because animation creates distance between the depicted behavior and its real-world implications. As the show went on, however, Quagmire became a character whose specific behaviors raised more serious concerns. An episode in which it is revealed that he has a large collection of women locked in cages was played as a dark joke. His ongoing references to non-consensual sexual scenarios were repeated across many seasons. The character was established as being approximately 70 years old while appearing to be in his late 30s, which was itself a joke, but which also suggested that his pursuit of very young women was something the show was aware of and finding humor in. The critical conversation about Quagmire is complicated by the fact that the show clearly knows what Quagmire is. He is not presented as a hero. The show often positions him as a flawed character whose behavior is part of the joke rather than a model for emulation. The episode in which Quagmire delivers his famous speech criticizing Brian for being a hypocrite is itself an example of the show using its most problematic regular character as the vehicle for some of its sharpest moral commentary. A character whose own behavior is frequently indefensible, calling out another character for hypocrisy is a comedic construction that requires the audience to hold two contradictory assessments of the same person simultaneously. The Meg abuse storyline has been covered extensively, but the specific character of Connie D'Amico, the popular girl at Meg's high school who serves as her primary tormentor at school, deserves mention as an example of the show creating a character whose existence in the narrative is primarily to make another character's suffering more elaborate and more sustained. Connie is never significantly humanized. She does not have storylines that explain her cruelty or give her complexity. She exists almost entirely to make Meg's social life miserable, and the joke her character represents has always been the same joke, which is that pretty, popular high school girls are cruel to less popular girls, and that this cruelty is amusing. The show's treatment of Joe Swanson and disability deserves more attention than it usually gets in discussions of Family Guy's controversies. Joe was introduced in a first-season episode as the impressive new neighbor in the cul-de-sac, a police officer who was respected by everyone and who Peter, specifically, was jealous of because of how popular Joe was. Joe's wheelchair was depicted in that episode as something that did not diminish him. He was capable, strong, funny, and genuinely admired. That version of Joe was an unusually positive depiction of disability in a mainstream animated comedy. What happened to Joe over subsequent seasons is a case study in the show's tendency to move characters toward their most extreme traits over time. Joe went from being a character who happened to use a wheelchair to being a character whose existence was increasingly defined by his disability, and by the way other characters, including his close friends, treated that disability as a source of comedy. His wife Bonnie stopped loving him. His friends mocked him. His capabilities were increasingly depicted as diminished. The Joe of the later seasons is barely recognizable as the same character introduced in Season 1, and the changes to him were never driven by any coherent story logic. They were driven by the show finding easy comedy in the gap between his disability and his aspirations. The character of Cleveland Brown, Peter's friend who left the show's main cast to star in his own spin-off called The Cleveland Show from 2009 to 2013 before returning to Family Guy, raises the question of racial representation in the show in a specific and interesting way. Cleveland is black, and he is voiced for the entirety of the show's run by Mike Henry, who is white. That casting choice was standard practice in animation when the show began, when the norm was for voice actors to be cast based on their vocal performance rather than on the match between their identity and the character's identity. By the late 2010s and early 2020s, that norm had begun to change, driven by a broader cultural reassessment of voice casting in animation. In June 2020, following the death of George Floyd and the resulting national conversation about race in American culture, Mike Henry announced that he would be stepping down from the role of Cleveland Brown. He said in a statement that he had recognized that it was time for an actor of color to play an animated person of color, and that he had been honored to have the opportunity to play this character. The transition was handled without major public controversy, and the show cast Arif Zahir, a black comedian, in the role beginning with season 19. The Cleveland recasting was not itself a major scandal, but it was part of a broader moment in which several animated shows simultaneously reconsidered similar casting situations. The Simpsons announced that it would no longer have white actors voice non-white characters. Bob's Burgers addressed a similar situation with its character Marshmallow. The recasting conversations were symptoms of a larger cultural shift that Family Guy, like many long-running cultural properties, was navigating in real time. The show's response, in Henry's voluntary departure and Zahir's casting, was relatively smooth compared to how these transitions went at some other shows. The ongoing question of racial representation in Family Guy's humor is more complex than the casting question and has not been addressed as cleanly. The show has a long history of jokes about racial stereotypes that use the same equal opportunity defense that it applies to all of its offensive humor. Whether that defense adequately addresses the specific concerns raised about specific jokes involving specific racial communities is a question that continues to be debated. Section 18. The wider cultural impact. It would be too easy to treat Family Guy's controversies as simply a list of bad decisions and conflicts. The controversies are also, in a genuine sense, evidence of impact. A show that nobody was watching and nobody cared about would not generate 188,000 FCC complaints. It would not get banned by a South American government. It would not produce national conversations about disability representation and political satire. The controversies are proportional to the cultural weight of the show, and for a sustained period, that cultural weight was very significant. Family Guy premiered at a moment in American television history when the medium was genuinely opening up. The late 1990s and early 2000s were a period of significant creative expansion in American television, driven partly by the success of HBO's original programming, partly by the internet's growing role in creating and sustaining fan communities, and partly by a generation of creators who had grown up with television as their primary cultural reference, and who were now making television that reflected that upbringing in deeply self-referential ways. Family Guy was part of that expansion, not on HBO but on broadcast network television, pushing the limits of what a show aimed at general audiences could say. The show's influence on the generation of comedy writers and performers who came of age watching it is probably its most lasting contribution to American culture, though it is a contribution that is difficult to quantify precisely because influence is inherently diffuse. The rapid-fire cutaway gag format that Family Guy popularized became an aesthetic that spread across other media. The style of humor that the show pioneered, built around unexpected juxtapositions, rapid-fire cultural references, and a relentless willingness to make jokes about anything, can be traced in the work of comedians, writers, and content creators who came of age watching the show. The show was also influential in the specific context of the internet's early years as a cultural distribution platform. YouTube launched in 2005. The same year, Family Guy returned from cancellation. The show's short, self-contained cutaway gags were perfectly suited to the clip-sharing format that YouTube represented. A 30-second Family Guy cutaway could be uploaded, shared, and viewed millions of times entirely independently of the episode it came from. The show was building a second audience online during the same period that its original broadcast audience was watching on Fox, and those two audiences had different relationships with the material. The online audience was engaging primarily with individual moments rather than with episodes as wholes, which reinforced the show's tendency to prioritize individual funny moments over coherent storytelling. The viral nature of the show's best moments also contributed to the viral nature of its controversies. When Brian died in November 2013, the outrage did not stay on television fan sites. It spread across every major social media platform. It trended on Twitter. It generated petition activity on change.org. It made national news. That level of cultural penetration for a cartoon's plot development was genuinely unprecedented. It suggested that Family Guy had created characters with enough emotional resonance to generate real grief responses in audiences, even if the show subsequently demonstrated that it was not willing to sustain the consequences of what it had done. The show's controversies also became a reference point in legal and regulatory discussions about the limits of broadcast content. The FCC complaints about Family Guy were among the largest single-show complaint collections in the agency's history. The Burnett lawsuit established precedent about the fair use of real people's creative legacies in television parody. The Bourne Company lawsuit established precedent about musical parody. These legal outcomes did not just affect Family Guy. They affected the broader landscape of what American broadcast television could do and say. The Venezuela ban, while primarily significant as a cultural curiosity rather than a legal precedent, illustrated the way that American popular culture's global reach creates diplomatic and regulatory dimensions that purely domestic controversies do not. A show about a fictional family in a fictional Rhode Island town became, briefly, a subject of official government concern in a South American country. That is a remarkable thing, and it reflects both the reach of American entertainment and the way that particular cultural products become symbolic targets for political arguments that are actually about something much larger than the product itself. Looking at the full arc of Family Guy's controversies, from the premiere in 1999 to the current moment, what becomes visible is a story about the relationship between creative ambition, commercial success, institutional inertia, and cultural change. The show was most vital when it was most ambitious. It was most controversial when its controversies served a creative purpose. It generated its most interesting public arguments during the periods when the show itself was doing its most interesting work. The later controversies, while sometimes still generating significant media attention, increasingly feel like echoes of earlier controversies rather than new chapters in an ongoing creative story. The show's creator is now more publicly associated with his frustration at the network airing it than with enthusiasm for what the show is doing. The characters that audiences fell in love with have been transformed in ways that most of those audiences did not want. The ratings tell a story of steady, sustained departure that no amount of renewal deals and licensing arrangements can fully obscure. And yet the show continues, carrying its enormous history of chaos and controversy forward into a future that nobody in 1998, when a young animator pitched a 15-minute pilot to a network, could possibly have imagined. Section 19. Smaller controversies that tell the bigger story. Not every Family Guy controversy was a major national news event. The show generated a continuous low-level hum of smaller controversies, individual jokes and moments that sparked complaints and debates without making front-page headlines, that cumulatively added up to something significant. These smaller controversies are worth examining because they reveal the texture of the show's relationship with its culture in a more granular way than the landmark cases. The show made jokes about 9/11 on multiple occasions, and each time generated some public reaction. The management of those jokes, the calibration of when and how to approach the subject, revealed something about the show's evolving sense of its own permission. In the immediate aftermath of the attacks, the show was cautious in the same way that the entire entertainment industry was cautious, pulling back from certain kinds of content out of sensitivity to a traumatic cultural moment. As years passed, the caution faded, and the show reintegrated 9/11 references into its catalog of cultural material. The joke about the JFK assassination, in which a Pez dispenser shaped like Kennedy's head is depicted being shot and the candy dispensing, generated significant complaints when it first aired. It is one of the show's early examples of humor that takes a real historical atrocity and uses it as physical comedy material. The fact that it generated complaints and then the show continued making similar jokes established the template for how the show would handle this kind of criticism throughout its run. The show made a joke about Michael J. Fox and Parkinson's disease that drew criticism from disability advocates and from people who felt that the show was mocking someone for a condition that caused genuine suffering. McFarlane's defense was consistent with the equal opportunity argument. The show makes jokes about every condition and every group, and treating Parkinson's disease as too serious for comedy was itself a form of condescension. The debate over that episode raised the same fundamental question that underlies almost every Family Guy controversy about disability, which is whether equal opportunity offense is actually experienced equally by people who have the relevant condition and people who observe it from outside. The song You Have AIDS, which appeared in an episode and was performed in the style of a barbershop quartet to a man who had just been diagnosed with HIV, generated a strong reaction from AIDS advocacy organizations who argued that the joke perpetuated stigma around an already heavily stigmatized condition. The show's defenders argued that the joke's target was the absurdity of the delivery, not the condition itself. That argument is more persuasive in some Family Guy jokes about serious subjects than in others, and the degree of its persuasiveness in the AIDS song case depends significantly on who is listening. The episode in which Peter attempts to purchase a nuclear weapon and the subplot involving the various obstacles he encounters in the American regulatory system for weapons sales was one of several episodes that generated quiet concern from law enforcement and national security observers who felt that the comedic framing of weapons acquisition trivialized real concerns about weapons access. These concerns were never formalized into complaints or lawsuits, but they were part of the background radiation of surveillance that accompanies any popular cultural property that regularly depicts scenarios involving weapons and violence. The show's handling of the AIDS crisis in America more broadly, its jokes about needle exchanges and infection transmission and treatment programs, was a subject of ongoing concern from advocacy organizations through the show's middle seasons. The concern was not that the show was taking a position on any of these issues, but that it was treating them as comedy material in ways that could affect public understanding and acceptance of people living with HIV. These concerns were typically not resolved through any formal mechanism. They were expressed, noted, and then continued to accumulate as the show kept making similar jokes. The show also generated controversy around its depictions of domestic violence that went beyond the Screams of Silence episode. Multiple episodes included casual jokes about violence between intimate partners that critics argued normalized behavior that was actively harmful in the real world. The show's defenders pointed to the cartoon logic of the humor and the consistent pattern of depicting all violence in exaggerated, consequence-free ways as sufficient context. Whether cartoon logic adequately distinguishes domestic violence from other forms of violence is a question that reasonable people answer differently. What all of these smaller controversies share is that they were addressed, when they were addressed at all, through the same framework that the show applied to all of its controversial content. The show is satire. The offense serves a comedic purpose. The equal opportunity argument applies. No special protection for any single group or topic. Whether that framework is adequate to the range of content it is being applied to is the question at the heart of every Family Guy controversy. And it is a question that the show itself never fully resolved, because resolving it would have required the show to develop a more consistent and defensible theory of what it was doing and why. Section 20. Final thoughts on a quarter century of chaos. There is a version of Family Guy's story that ends with triumph, a show created by a young animator at a network that was not sure what to do with it. A show canceled not once but twice, surviving through the loyalty of a devoted audience that found it on late-night cable reruns and bought the DVDs and signed the petitions and demanded it back. A show that came back from the dead and spent another 2 decades making television that millions of people cared about enough to be angry at. There is a version of the story that ends with decline, a show whose golden years are further and further in the rearview mirror, whose main character became unrecognizable, whose creative heart stepped back and handed the keys to people who did not fully understand what they had been given, whose ratings tell a story of slow departure that no corporate renewal deal can reverse. There is a version of the story that ends with controversy as legacy, a show whose most enduring contribution to American culture is a catalog of banned episodes, lawsuits, government sanctions, and federal complaints that together constitute an unintentional history of what American broadcast television would and would not permit across a quarter century of cultural change. All three of those versions are true simultaneously. That is the thing about Family Guy. It is not one story. It is several stories happening at the same time, in the same universe, sometimes even in the same episode. The show that premiered in January 1999 and immediately started making enemies was genuinely doing something new and important. The show that survived 2 cancellations to come back in 2005 was a tribute to the persistence of an audience that knew what it wanted. The show that produced its best episodes, the ones that are still revisited and celebrated, demonstrated that animation as a medium is capable of genuine emotional depth and sharp intelligence when the people making it are fully committed. The show that generated 188,000 FCC complaints, got banned in Venezuela, killed and resurrected its most beloved character in a calculated ratings maneuver, and spent a decade brutalizing a teenage girl character while its creator publicly wished he were on a different network, demonstrated what happens when the commercial logic of an entertainment property completely overtakes its creative logic. The controversies, from the smallest individual complaints to the international government bans, are the seismograph readings of a show that spent more than 25 years shaking the ground it walked on. Some of those shakes were intentional, some were accidents. Some were genuine breakthroughs that the culture needed. Some were just noise, but none of it was boring. For 25 years, Family Guy managed to be interesting even when it was at its worst, which is a difficult trick. The show understood something about attention that its critics often missed, which is that being talked about, even negatively, is better than not being talked about. That the controversy was part of the show. That the public argument was part of the content. That the people filing FCC complaints and writing letters to the Catholic League and signing change.org petitions were, in their own way, participating in the show just as much as the people laughing at it in their living rooms. Family Guy made enemies the way some people make friends, compulsively and without particular strategy, and then found that the enemies were as useful to it as the fans. The Parents Television Council gave the show decades of free publicity. The Venezuelan ban made the show famous in regions of the internet where it had barely penetrated before. The Brian Griffin death petition gave the show its biggest social media moment in years. Even South Park's sustained campaign against the show's creative values helped keep Family Guy relevant to the kind of critical conversation that might otherwise have moved on to other subjects. That is the final and perhaps most counterintuitive thing about Family Guy's controversies. They were not only costs to be paid for creative decisions that went too far, they were also, in many cases, assets that the show accumulated and deployed. The show's reputation for controversy was itself a form of brand identity that attracted audiences who wanted to watch something that was not safe, not careful, and not designed to avoid giving offense. Every time someone was outraged by Family Guy, they were also confirming something that the show's audience already believed about it, which was that it was brave enough, or reckless enough, or both, to say the things that other shows would not say. The question that outlasts all of the specific controversies is whether that reputation was earned or manufactured, whether the offense served purposes beyond itself, whether the show used its courage, such as it was, in service of something larger than the shock of the moment. The answer is different for different episodes, different moments, different seasons. In the early years, more often than not, the answer favors the show. In the middle years, it is mixed. In the later years, the show increasingly used the appearance of courage to avoid the work that genuine courage in comedy actually requires, which is not saying things that are offensive, but saying things that are true. The controversies will continue as long as the show continues. They are part of what the show is. They are written into its DNA, encoded in the creative philosophy that its creator developed before he fully understood what he was creating. They will be the last things remembered about it, long after the specific episodes are forgotten and the characters have faded from cultural memory, and the fight about whether it was ever as good as it seemed like it was has finally exhausted itself. Sleep well. The controversies will still be there in the morning. If you have made it this far through the full history of one of television's most complicated shows, thank you genuinely for spending this time with it. If stories like this are what you come here for, please subscribe. It genuinely helps keep the channel going, and it means more of these long, detailed journeys through television history are on the way. Take care of yourselves wherever you are. End of script. Appendix. The controversies in context. A deeper look at what the record reveals. Across all of the major controversies, the lawsuits, the bans, the public feuds, and the quieter internal disputes, several patterns become visible when you step back far enough to see the whole picture at once. These patterns are not randomly distributed across the show's history. They cluster in ways that reveal something meaningful about the show's evolution and about the culture that produced and received it. The first pattern is that the show's most defensible controversies cluster in its earliest seasons. The episodes that generated the most interesting public conversations, the ones where the arguments on both sides had merit and where the show's position can be defended on artistic and satirical grounds, tend to be from seasons 1 through 7. The Weinstein episode is a genuine piece of satirical comedy that uses the stereotype of Jewish financial acumen to make a larger point about how stereotypes function. Partial Terms of Endearment is a carefully researched episode about one of the most contested political and ethical questions in American life. Even some of the religious content controversies in this period reflect a show that had a specific perspective it was trying to express, even if the expression was sometimes crude. The controversies from seasons 8 and beyond are, on average, less interesting and less defensible. The Brian death controversy is the most prominent exception, because it at least touched on something genuine, which was the audience's real attachment to the character. But most of the controversy from the show's later seasons is the kind of controversy you get when a show is throwing things at the wall to see what sticks, rather than making deliberate choices about what to say and why. The second pattern is that the show's relationship with its critics followed a consistent arc. The early critics, the Parents Television Council and the Catholic League and the FCC complainants, were largely religious and politically conservative organizations objecting to the show's treatment of religion, its sexual content, and its political leanings. As the show went on, the critics shifted. The later critics were more likely to be feminist commentators objecting to the Meg storyline, LGBTQ advocates objecting to specific representations, disability rights organizations objecting to specific jokes. This shift is significant because it reflects a broader change in which kinds of media criticism had cultural visibility and authority. The PTC's influence peaked in the mid-2000s and has declined since. The kind of criticism focused on representation and harm to specific communities became more prominent in the 2010s and 2020s. Family Guy navigated both periods of critical attention and was shaped by both. The third pattern is that the show's most significant controversies were almost never resolved. The PTC continued its campaign against the show for years, without achieving any lasting changes to its content. The Burnett lawsuit was decided but did not change the show's approach to using real people's likenesses. The Brian death controversy generated enormous noise and then was resolved in a way that explicitly refused to take the audience's investment seriously. The South Park feud was never formally ended. The McFarlane versus Fox tension was never resolved, just institutionalized into an ongoing public awkwardness that both parties seem to accept as the permanent condition of their relationship. This lack of resolution is consistent with the show's fundamental philosophy. Family Guy is not a show about resolution. It is a show about the ongoing, unresolvable nature of human dysfunction. The Griffin family never really gets better. The characters never truly grow. The show has no theory of progress, no arc of improvement, no destination toward which the narrative is headed. Each episode resets to the status quo, and the controversies follow the same logic. They generate attention, create conversations, and then end without fundamentally changing anything. The fourth pattern involves the question of who gets to decide what Family Guy means. The show's creators have consistently argued for a specific reading of the content. It is satire, it uses offense as a tool, the equal opportunity argument applies. The cartoon logic removes it from the domain of real-world harm. But the people who filed complaints, brought lawsuits, and publicly objected to specific content were also making arguments about what the show meant, and their arguments were grounded in real experiences of how media representation affects real communities. Neither side in these arguments has been definitively right. The show has produced content that is genuinely satire and that serves genuine artistic purposes. It has also produced content that is genuinely harmful, or at minimum genuinely gratuitous, and that cannot be fully defended by the equal opportunity argument or the cartoon logic defense. The difficulty is that these two categories of content exist in the same show, often in the same episode, sometimes in adjacent scenes. The show does not reliably distinguish between them. It makes no promise to the audience that any given joke is the good kind rather than the bad kind. Living with that uncertainty is part of what it means to watch Family Guy. The audience that has stayed with the show across its long run has made a kind of implicit bargain. In exchange for the genuinely brilliant moments, for the episodes that make you laugh until you cannot breathe and then make you feel something unexpected, you accept a certain amount of content that you would rather not have seen. Whether that bargain has remained worthwhile over 25 years is a question that each viewer answers individually, and the fact that the show still has millions of viewers suggests that many people still think it is. The show's controversies will eventually end when the show ends. But the cultural questions they raised, about what satire is for, about who bears the cost of offensive humor, about what responsibility a creator has to the audience that gives a work its meaning, will outlast the show itself. They are the questions at the center of the modern American entertainment industry's ongoing negotiation with its own limits. Family Guy raised those questions louder and more persistently than almost any other piece of entertainment in its era. That is not nothing. It might even be the most important thing about it. What happens to a show that survives long enough to become its own historical artifact, a document of what was funny and what was offensive and what was contested across a specific period of American cultural history? It becomes exactly the kind of thing we have been exploring in this script. Not a simple object of nostalgia or a simple object of condemnation, but something more complicated and more interesting. A record of the ongoing argument that American culture has been having with itself about who gets to laugh at what and why. Family Guy entered that argument at full volume in 1999, kept yelling through 2 cancellations and 2 revivals and more than 2 decades of production, and shows no sign of stopping. The argument has changed around it. The culture has changed around it. But the show persists, carrying all of its controversies forward the way a river carries everything that has fallen into it, changed by the weight but still moving. The Conway-Twitty problem and the longer history of lazy controversy. There is one more thing worth exploring before this script concludes, because it represents a specific kind of controversy that the show generated that is different from all the others, and that tells you something specific about what happened to the show's creative philosophy over time. This is the Conway-Twitty controversy, which is not really a controversy in the traditional sense of generating public outrage or legal action. It is a controversy about craft. Conway-Twitty was an American country music singer whose career spanned from the 1950s through the 1990s. He died in June 1993. He had nothing to do with Family Guy. He would have been surprised to know that a decade after his death, his performances were being used as comedy material on a primetime animated show on Fox. The joke, as it emerged across several Family Guy episodes beginning in the mid-2000s, involved the show cutting away from whatever was happening in the main story to a full, unedited performance of a Conway-Twitty song. Not a clip, not a reference, an entire performance lasting several minutes, during which the characters in the main story were presumably just standing somewhere waiting for the show to return to them. The first time this happened, the surprise of it was the joke. A show that is known for quick, random cutaways, suddenly dedicating several minutes to an unedited performance of a song by a deceased country singer. Nobody in the show's primary demographic had any strong feelings about, was genuinely unexpected. Unexpected things can be funny. The unexpectedness was the punchline. The punchline worked. The problem was that the show repeated it multiple times, across multiple seasons. The Conway-Twitty gag became a recurring bit, appearing whenever the writers apparently needed to fill time in an episode without having to generate actual content. The second time the gag appeared, the surprise was gone. All that remained was the performance itself. The third and fourth and fifth times, what was left was a show demonstrating very clearly that it had run out of material to fill the episode and was using a deceased country singer's footage as a substitute. No organization filed complaints about the Conway-Twitty gag. No government banned the show because of it. No advocacy group wrote letters to Fox. But it generated more genuine critical contempt from people who cared about the quality of the show than almost any other single recurring choice. South Park's critique of Family Guy, the manatee with idea balls satire, pointed at exactly the kind of thing the Conway-Twitty gag represented. The show using time rather than thought to fill episodes, substituting duration for content, confusing the audience's passive endurance of something with their active enjoyment of it. The Conway Twitty gag is also the clearest example of a show being self-aware about its own failures without using that self-awareness to fix those failures. The writers knew the gag was lazy. They kept doing it anyway. They even made meta-jokes about the laziness of the gag, having characters comment on it while it was happening. But the meta-commentary was itself being used as a substitute for actual comedy, which is a form of laziness that is more sophisticated than the original laziness but no less real. There is a version of this pattern in every extended creative controversy the show generated. The show makes a problematic creative choice. The audience objects. The show demonstrates, through meta-commentary or self-reference or eventually a reversal of the choice, that it is aware of the objection. And then it makes the same choice again, because the structural incentives that produced the choice in the first place have not changed. This is not unique to Family Guy. It is the standard condition of long-running commercial television. The incentives of commercial television push toward repetition of what has worked before, toward serving the established audience rather than challenging it, toward the safe choice rather than the bold one. Family Guy's particular version of this condition is interesting because the show was built on the premise that it would make the bold choice, and the gap between that premise and the Conway Twitty gag is the distance the show traveled over 25 years. The full history of Family Guy's controversies is also, ultimately, the history of a show learning the difference between the bold choice and the lazy choice, and slowly, over many seasons, choosing the lazy one more often. The controversies generated by bold choices, the ones that produced interesting arguments and genuine legal battles and actual cultural change, are the controversies that belong to the show's golden years. The controversies generated by lazy choices, the ones that are just examples of a show doing something gratuitous without purpose, belong to the later seasons. That distinction is not always obvious in the moment. Sometimes the bold choice and the lazy choice look similar from the outside. Both generate complaints. Both get the show in the news. Both result in letters to the FCC. The difference is what remains after the controversy fades. After a bold choice controversy fades, there is usually still something worth discussing, a genuine question that was raised that does not have an easy answer. After a lazy choice controversy fades, there is usually nothing left but the memory of having been annoyed. Family Guy has generated both kinds in abundance. That is the complete picture. A show that was capable of genuine creative courage and genuine creative laziness, often in the same week, for more than a quarter century, surrounded at all times by the noise of everyone who had an opinion about it, which, over 25 years, turned out to be almost everyone. That is the story of Family Guy's controversies. It is a story without a clean ending, because the show is still going, and because the arguments it raised are still unresolved, and because the things it did, good and bad and somewhere in between, are still there in the archive, available to anyone who wants to revisit them. But for now, that is enough. The history has been told. The scandals have been cataloged. The feuds have been traced from their beginnings to their current states. The lawsuits have been decided and the bans have been noted and the federal complaints have been counted. Sleep well, knowing that somewhere in the vast archive of American television, Peter Griffin is still doing something someone is about to be angry about. This has been a complete run through the wild controversies and scandals of one of television's most persistently chaotic shows. If you have been listening along and enjoyed the journey, please do subscribe. It means everything for keeping this kind of long-form content alive. Thank you for being here. End of complete script. The transcript that lived forever. Family Guy and the Internet Age. There is one dimension of Family Guy's controversies that was simply not possible for any television show that came before it, and that has shaped every controversy the show has generated since roughly 2005. That dimension is the Internet, and specifically, the ability of any viewer anywhere in the world to clip, share, remix, and redistribute any moment from any episode of the show in a matter of minutes. The Turban Cowboy situation would not have become the kind of crisis it became without the internet. The edited clip that combined two unrelated scenes from the episode into something that appeared to predict the Boston Marathon bombing was created by an internet user, distributed through YouTube, and amplified by social media and conspiracy theory websites within hours of the actual bombing. The clip's reach exceeded anything that a traditional media environment could have produced in such a short time. Fox was having to respond to a crisis that had been created and distributed entirely online by people who were not affiliated with the show or with Fox in any way. The Brian Griffin death controversy was shaped even more thoroughly by the internet. The Change.org petition reached 100,000 signatures within 72 hours because the internet allowed grief, outrage, and petition infrastructure to operate at a speed that would have been impossible in any previous era. The hashtag #BringBackBrian trended because Twitter made it possible for millions of people to coordinate an emotional response to a fictional event in near real time. The hoax website with the countdown clock was created and spread across fan communities within hours of the episode airing. The internet transformed Family Guy's controversies from events that played out over days and weeks to events that played out over hours and days. It compressed the cycle of controversy, response, counter-response, and resolution in ways that changed the character of each controversy. A controversy that might have lingered in the letters pages of newspapers for weeks in an earlier era was instead resolved or abandoned within a news cycle that was measured in hours. The internet also changed the relationship between the show and its audience in ways that affected how controversies were interpreted. In the pre-internet era, an audience's reaction to a television show was largely invisible to the show's creators, except through ratings and letters. In the internet era, that reaction is immediate, visible, and measurable. The Family Guy writing staff could, if they chose, read thousands of viewer reactions to an episode within hours of it airing. Whether that visibility improved the show or made it more reactive to the wrong incentives is a genuine question, and there is evidence on both sides. The internet's role in Family Guy's controversies also includes the positive contribution it made to the show's survival and revival. The Adult Swim reruns that demonstrated the show's potential for a revived run were watched by people who did not necessarily watch the original Fox broadcasts, but who shared their enthusiasm for the show through early internet fan communities. The DVD sales that convinced Fox to revive the show were driven partly by internet fan advocacy that concentrated purchasing decisions in ways that the network could not ignore. The show survived its second cancellation partly because the internet had created a new kind of community around it, one that was more visible and more organized than the fan communities that had existed for any canceled show before it. The show's current controversies, those generated by its most recent seasons, are born and die in a media environment that bears almost no resemblance to the one that existed when the pilot aired in 1999. The controversies are faster, louder in the short term, and less durable than the controversies of the show's early years. The Turban Cowboy situation is still discussed. The Brian death is still discussed. The South Park feud is still discussed. Controversies from the show's most recent seasons tend to generate strong reactions for a few days and then fade from the conversation, because there is always new content competing for attention in a media environment that never stops moving. This is not unique to Family Guy. It is the condition of all cultural controversy in the internet age. But Family Guy has been in production across the full transition from a pre-internet to a fully internet-saturated media environment, which means its controversies are a useful timeline of how that transition changed the character of cultural argument. The controversies from 1000, 999, and 2000 feel different from the controversies from 2013 and 2023. Not just because the show changed, but because the medium of controversy changed around the show. What remains constant across the entire span is the audience's capacity for genuine investment. The 188,000 FCC complaints in 2009 required real people to take a real action, to go to the FCC website or write a physical letter, to express outrage about a television show in a form that required effort. The 100,000 Change.org signatures in 2013 required real people to go to a website and sign their name to a petition. These are not passive responses. They are evidence that people who watched Family Guy felt strongly enough about what they were watching to do something about it. That is the measure of a show's cultural significance. And by that measure, Family Guy has been one of the most culturally significant programs in American television history. The show found its significance in the arguments it started, in the complaints it generated, in the lawsuits it defended, in the countries that banned it and the federal agencies that declined to act on complaints about it, in the careers it launched and the norms it challenged, and the conversations it forced. None of that happened by accident. It happened because a young creator from Rhode Island had a specific vision for a specific kind of show, and because that vision was just transgressive enough and just human enough to matter to people who encountered it. The controversies are the evidence of that mattering. They are not separate from the show's legacy. They are the legacy written in the language of legal filings and government press releases and Twitter hashtags and change.org petitions and living room arguments between people who agreed about everything except whether Family Guy had gone too far this time. The answer to that question is always the same. It depends on which episode you are watching, which moment you are looking at, and who you are when you look at it. That is the only honest answer. It has always been the only honest answer. And the show has been providing new material for the question for 25 years and counting. Complete. Thank you for listening. One more thing. The Emmy that changed everything. There is a chapter in Family Guy's history that gets somewhat overlooked in conversations dominated by lawsuits and bans, and it involves a moment of genuine critical recognition that the show received at the height of its powers. In 2009, Family Guy was nominated for the Primetime Emmy Award for Outstanding Comedy Series. This was a nomination that had never been given to an animated series since the Flintstones received it in 1961, nearly half a century earlier. Not The Simpsons, which had been the standard-bearer for quality in animated television for 2 decades. Not any other animated comedy. Family Guy? The nomination came during a period when the show's cultural standing was at one of its highest points, several years after the revival, with the show generating consistent ratings and cultural commentary. The Emmy nomination was recognition from the television industry itself that Family Guy was operating at a level of quality that deserved to be mentioned alongside the best live-action comedies of its era. The show did not win, but the nomination was significant enough on its own. It represented the establishment's acknowledgement that whatever Family Guy was doing, it was doing it at a level that could not be dismissed. The Parents Television Council, which had spent years filing complaints about the show, was now in the position of watching the same industry they were trying to pressure give the show its highest honor. TV Guide's ranking in 2013, which placed Family Guy at number 9 on its list of the greatest television cartoons of all time, added another layer to the critical rehabilitation of a show that its harshest critics had been trying to get canceled for years. These accolades are part of the show's controversy history as much as the FCC complaints, because they represent the other side of the cultural argument, the side that said Family Guy was not just tolerated but genuinely great. That critical reputation has since changed. The show no longer receives the kind of serious critical attention it got in the mid-2000s and early 2010s. Its Emmy nomination feels like something from a different era. The TV Guide ranking, if it were conducted today, would likely produce a different result, but the record stands. Family Guy was, at a specific moment in its history, considered by the television industry to be among the best of what television could produce. That moment of recognition, placed alongside the bans and the lawsuits and the federal complaints, gives the complete picture of what Family Guy was. A show that was simultaneously the worst thing on television and one of the best things on television, depending on which episode you were watching and which critic was evaluating it. A show that could generate 188,000 complaints to a federal agency and an Emmy nomination in the same 4-year period. A show that was genuinely great enough to deserve serious critical attention and genuinely problematic enough to deserve serious critical concern, and that never resolved the tension between those two things, never settled into one category or the other, and remained interesting partly because of that unresolved tension for longer than any of its critics or champions probably expected. That is the fullest version of Family Guy's legacy. Not just the controversies, not just the triumphs, both of them together in a story that is still being told by a show that is still on the air, still generating opinions, still making people react. The noise continues. And somewhere in that noise, if you listen carefully enough, you can still hear the thing that made people care about it in the first place. End of script. Thank you for being here. The moments that stuck. Why Family Guy's controversies outlive the news cycle. Ask anyone who grew up watching Family Guy what they remember most vividly, and you will rarely hear a description of a perfectly constructed plot. You will more often hear about a specific joke, a specific moment, a specific scene that lodged itself in memory in a way that is resistant to time. Some of those remembered moments are the brilliant ones, the ones that made you laugh until your face hurt. Some of them are the controversial ones, the moments that made you uncomfortable, that made you argue with whoever was watching with you, that you have been arguing about with yourself ever since. The stickiness of Family Guy's controversial moments is itself a subject worth thinking about, because it reveals something about how controversy functions in memory. The moments that generated the most public outrage are often not the moments that stick most persistently for individual viewers. The 188,000 FCC complaints were filed about a specific piece of content that most of those 188,000 people probably do not think about often now. But the Brian Griffin death, which generated its own enormous reaction, is a moment that a large percentage of the show's audience can describe in detail even a decade later. The Carol Burnett lawsuit is a note in the show's legal history, but the specific episodes that made Burnett angry are not the episodes that most longtime viewers cite when you ask them to describe Family Guy's relationship with real people. What makes a controversial moment stick is not the scale of the reaction it generates, but whether the moment itself has something in it that connects to a real experience or a real feeling. The Brian death stuck because it touched something genuine in the audience's relationship with a character they had been watching for over a decade. The Sarah Palin controversy stuck partly because of Andrea Faye Friedman's extraordinary response, which made the episode about something more interesting than a cartoon joke. The South Park feud stuck because it named something that long-term fans of Family Guy had been feeling without being able to articulate. The Conway Twitty gag, which generated less formal controversy than most of the events described in this script, is remembered with remarkable clarity by people who watched the show during that period. Not because it caused outrage, but because it was so specifically, so precisely, an example of a show making no effort, and doing it in front of an audience that had once expected significant effort. The absence of effort is sometimes more memorable than the effort itself. What this suggests is that the controversies that matter most in Family Guy's cultural legacy are the ones that were connected to something the audience genuinely cared about, the characters, the creative standard the show had set for itself, the specific way in which the show had defined itself as different from other shows. When the controversies touched those things, they generated the kind of lasting conversation that still happens around the show's history. When they did not, they faded quickly, regardless of their size in the moment. That pattern is a guide to what was actually important about Family Guy. The show mattered when it gave people something to care about. The controversies that still matter are the ones that arose from people caring deeply, either because the show had done something that violated their investment in it, or because the show had done something that genuinely needed to be contested. The show at its best, and this is the thing that its most devoted and most critical audiences agree on, was a show that people cared about enough to fight over. The fighting itself was evidence of the caring, and the caring was the thing that made the show, for whatever period it lasted, worth the trouble of watching. All of it. The laughter and the outrage, the lawsuits and the Emmy nominations, the federal complaints and the critical acclaim, the dead dogs and the resurrected dogs, and the Venezuelan government threats and the South Park satires, and the Oscars jokes that turned out to be something different than they looked, all of it adds up to 25 years of television that people could not stop caring about even when they wanted to. That is a form of success. It is not the form that gets measured in contemporary ratings, numbers, or in the carefully worded press releases of network executives. But it is a form of success that outlasts those things. It is the kind of success that this script is an example of, which is that the story of Family Guy is still worth telling, still rich enough to spend 3 hours with, still capable of surprising you with what it reveals when you look at it all together. The controversies will keep coming as long as the show keeps running, and long after the show stops running, they will still be there, preserved in the archive of American cultural history, marking the specific moments when a cartoon about a fictional family in a fictional Rhode Island town managed repeatedly, improbably, and sometimes brilliantly to make the whole country stop and have an argument about something that mattered. That is the final word on Family Guy's controversies. Sleep well.